Global Values 101. Introduction. I read Global Values 101 many years ago when I was desperate to make a difference. I'm as desperate as I ever was, maybe more. I remember being so enthralled by it. Then a few months ago, I tried to remember the things that stood out for me, and I couldn't. So this is me going down memory lane to remind myself some important lessons from this collection of interviews of organizers, agitators, and resistors drawn from a wide range of professions. Brief background about how Global Values 101 came about. Brian Palmer, the lecturer who put it all together, with one of his grad students, Kate Holbrook, explained, quote, during the neoliberal 1990s, Harvard subcontracted jobs and paid miserly wages to the people who mowed the lawns, mopped the floors, and cooked the potatoes. An employee at the world's wealthiest university could work full-time and be homeless at night. Many students pleaded on these workers' behalf, but to no avail. Then in April 2001, 50 students stormed into the Harvard president's office. They carried backpacks full of food and cell phones and announced that they would occupy the office until an adequate living wage was paid to the janitors and cooks. The campus was electrified. Daily demonstrations took place outside the president's office, and dining hall workers delivered free pizzas to the occupiers through the windows. Dozens of people began camping in tents in Harvard Yard, ready to bear witness at any hour if the police tried to remove the protesters by force. This went on for 21 days, during which time the university's power holders, Harvard Corporation, were being increasingly embarrassed by the media coverage, with stories spotlighting the gap between the gold and parachuted money managers and the hard-knock janitors. On day 21, the corporation agreed on a living wage for the workers. In that atmosphere of engagement and hope, my students and I began to notice the injuries of inequality that secured our affluence. We interviewed cooks and cleaners and security guards. In a university fed by the donations of billionaires, we read Barbara Ehrenreich's words about a different kind of philanthropy. The working poor, she wrote, are, quote, the major philanthropists of our society. They neglect their own children so that the children of others will be cared for. They live in substandard housing so that others' homes will be shiny and perfect. They endure privation so that inflation will be low and stock prices will be high. To be a member of the working poor is to be an anonymous donor, a nameless benefactor to everyone else. End quote. Brian then started to work on a course around these themes. Then September 11th happened. Students from a wide range of disciplines, all with a common interest in influencing a world gone wrong, began to register for his course and fill it. Regarding the way he structured the course, Palmer says, quote, my teaching philosophy began with the recognition that neither I nor anyone else had definitive answers to the ethical and political questions we were exploring. Quote, my teaching philosophy began with the recognition that neither I nor anyone else had definitive answers to the ethical and political questions we were exploring. Before each semester, Kate and I scheduled a dozen or more individuals to visit the course for in-class interviews. Our guests did not give any lectures. Instead, the students read work by or about them. Lecture in French means reading. Groups of students then prepared questions in advance and posed them during the interviews. End quote. I go through my favorite bits of the interviews below. I just selected the bits that stood out for me, and I'll try and explain why they grabbed me in this particular moment that we're living in. Let me know what sticks with you and why in the comments if you're able to. Get the book and read it. It's worth the time. Alright, before we jump in, let me close with a quote Brian Palmer shares. Quote, as the 13th Saint Albertus Magnus put it, the greatest of all human pleasures is to seek the truth in conversation. My colleagues and I hope that the conversations in this book will spark many others. End quote. I hope so too. Let's jump in. Howard Zinn, historian. Howard is hands down one of my favorite people. I'm currently reading SNCC, SNCC, The New Abolitionists, and I swear it's like a love letter. Like his love letter to the SNCC team, to black people, and to everyone involved in the struggle. The author of more than 20 books, he is best known for his powerful memoir, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, A Personal History of Our Times, and the bestseller, A People's History of the United States, 1492 to present. Okay, on to his interview. Question. In your book, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, you discuss how we are all susceptible to changing attitudes and beliefs. Can you describe a time when you experienced a change in attitudes and beliefs, and what sparked that change? Howard Zinn. So I went to this demonstration, which was a vaguely communist demonstration. I didn't know, I swear, I didn't know. Please tell everybody I didn't know it was a communist demonstration. At a certain point, a mounted officer attacked this peaceful demonstration, and soon after, I was smacked by a policeman, by either his fist or a club, and I was knocked unconscious. Then when I woke up, now I am over-dramatizing this, the sky cleared. It suddenly occurred to me, police do not attack peaceful demonstrations. After all, we have a Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. But they were attacking all these people. It occurred to me that the government is not neutral. The government is generally on the side of privilege and power, and the Bill of Rights has only as much meaning as whoever has power to enforce it or ignore it. That was a turning point, you might say, from being a liberal to being a radical. A liberal still has some faith in the goodwill of the system. The US really doesn't mean to do ill in Iraq. We all have good intentions. We had good intentions in Vietnam. It was just a mistake, as McNamara would say. A radical says no. The truth is, they do not have good intentions. Their interests are different than that of most people. End quote. Why this passage? First of all, it's so true. All these laws and policies don't mean anything. As in, they don't have any power on their own. They depend wholly on the goodwill of the people with the power to enforce it. Look at Palestine and all the court cases that have found that Israel is breaking international law and committing genocide, and still bombs are being dropped and people are still starving. I think about Kenya and all the protections the Constitution affords us. The president knows, the police know, they don't give one fuck. So we have all these rights, but they're just on paper. Tell Rex Masai and Denzel Omondi and Beasley Kamau and the countless others that the Constitution defends their right to assemble and protest. These laws are dependent on those in power. Second, people in power are not making mistakes. Every fucked up thing they do is deliberate. And that's a critical thing to remind ourselves. They have different interests and goals, and theirs are the complete opposite of ours. They do not have a single good intention. Certainly not when it comes to us. Another key turning point for him happened while he was teaching at Spelman College, a black women's college in Atlanta, USA. Howard Zinn. Sometimes you know something vaguely, but then it is brought home to you powerfully. What was brought home to me powerfully was that you cannot depend on the government or the Constitution if you had some deep grievances with the society. If there's some serious problem in the society, it is not going to be solved by the initiative of the government or by what the law says. It is going to come from what the people themselves do. That came from watching the presumably liberal federal government of Kennedy and Johnson not willing to do anything to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution until the black people in the South rose up to do it by themselves. They got out and they protested and they went to jail and they got beaten and some of them got killed, and they created a commotion in the nation and in the world that finally caused the government of Kennedy and Johnson to begin to move in the direction of ending racial segregation. For me, this was a lesson in democracy. Democracy is what the people do. It is not what the government does. Democracy is what the people do. It's not what the government does. Question. Could you give us examples of a society today or in history that you believe other societies should emulate? Howard Zinn. I can think of 2 times in history when people created societies that seem to me worth emulating. One of these was in the few months of the Paris Commune in 1871. For a brief time in 1871, the Paris Commune had something very close to a real democracy. Decisions were made in democratic forums all over Paris, and the members of the Commune, that is, the representatives, the leaders, established that they would get no wage higher than that of the average worker in Paris. Try that with our senators and congressmen. It was a situation where the theater was free, where culture flourished. It was a remarkably democratic society for a few months. I guess too democratic, so it was crushed by the French army coming in from Versailles. The other model is Catalonia in the first months of the Spanish Civil War. If you read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, he was in the Spanish Civil War. He describes what happens when the anarchists took over Barcelona. The phrase took over does not exactly fit the idea of anarchists, but anarchism, you might say, flourished in Barcelona for about 6 months in the early years of the Spanish Civil War. Orwell describes how in this remarkably egalitarian society, people shared things, and there was virtually no crime because people had the things they needed, or could get the things they needed by exchanging goods and services with other people. It was a peaceful society, until the forces from the outside moved in to destroy it. Question. You wrote, I've always resented the smug statements of politicians of how in America, if you worked hard, you would become rich. Many of us believe this. We have always been told that if we work hard, we will succeed. Do you not believe in this ethic of the American dream? Zinn. No, I do not believe in the fantasy. I don't even want to call it a dream, that there is some necessary relationship between how hard you work and how prosperous and successful you are. Sure, there are people who work hard and become successful. Sometimes there is a relationship. Often there isn't. The point is that there is no necessary relationship. A lot also depends on what you consider work. Sometimes people think that the president of the university works 50 times as hard as the janitor at the university. I don't think so. Society does not reward people with material benefits on the basis of how hard they work. A typical CEO in the 60s had an income about 40 times the income of the average American worker. Today it is 400 times. It is ridiculous. How hard does a CEO work? I think of people who are nurses, social workers, elementary or high school teachers. I think of people who work hard, doing very useful things, and they barely have enough money to get by. I think of artists and musicians and actors and poets who have such a hard time in this free market society. The market dooms people like that to a subsistence living. Whether you become prosperous or not does not depend on how hard you work or how smart you are. How do you calculate smartness? Do you go by IQ tests? Some people are smart at things that make a lot of money, and others are smart at things that do not make a lot of money. Certainly, there is no correlation between how prosperous or how materially successful you become and what contribution you make to society. All you have to do is look at the fortunes that are made by the people who produced poisons or nuclear weapons. End quote. Question. How were you so convinced of the mission of World War II enough to leave your family and wife behind, potentially sacrificing your life? What dangers do you see now in this so-called blind faith in a cause? Zinn. I want to answer your question about how to overcome blind loyalty, and it is blind loyalty. You enter the military and you don't think, you do your job. I understand how ordinary people can commit atrocities in warfare. Ordinary guys can go up there, drop bombs, kill women and children. It is just doing your job. You make one judgment at the very beginning of your participation in the war, the judgment that I am on the right side. There is Hitler or Saddam Hussein. Once you make that decision, they are the bad guys, we are the good guys. You don't have to think anymore. No more judgments have to be made, no more considerations. You have already decided everything, and at that point, you can do whatever you want without thinking about it. That is how you get the bombing of civilians in enormous numbers in Dresden, 100,000 dead in Tokyo in one night, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I see this painful scene on television where they talk to a young GI in Iraq. Quote, "Why are you here?" He answers, "Well, I feel that I owe this to my country." And quote, "Really? How do you know you're doing this for your country? You are doing this for your government. There's a difference between your government and your country. There is a difference between your government and your country." Question. In your article, Growing Up Class Conscious, you explain that even when you moved out of a world of just scraping by, never having enough, bringing your children to free medical clinics, even when you received your proper degrees and became a college professor, you never forgot that way of life, and you never stopped being class conscious. How do you suggest that those who come from more privileged backgrounds live both socially conscious and socially responsible lives? Story time. Zinn. I suppose my present class consciousness comes at least partly out of my own background. But people with different class backgrounds also are class conscious. So I cannot ask you to rework your background, right? But whoever you are and whatever your background, you're a person of relatively free will. Therefore, you're a person who is capable of looking at the world, at the distribution of wealth, at the distribution of power, and deciding in what way you can intercede and help the situation and help redress the grievances of people in this country who have to work too hard for much too little. I remember a few years ago there was a situation in a factory just north of Boston. Immigrant women workers in a cotton factory, and 10 of them were fired for trying to organize a union because the conditions were absolutely abominable. Well, people from all over the community came to support them. Students at Harvard and other colleges, members of the Teamsters unions, people from churches, it didn't matter what their class background was. They all gathered in one place and demonstrated and walked into the office of the owner of the factory and would not leave until certain demands were met. And so about 13 of us were arrested for refusing to leave. And 4 days later, the employer capitulated and rehired those people who had been fired. But that was an example of people of varying class backgrounds joining in solidarity to do something about economic inequities in society. So I think, yes, that is something everybody can do. Nobody need feel trapped by their money or their parents' money or the jobs that they have. We all have the capacity to break out of whatever restrictions our class status puts us in and do what we think is right. Elaine Scarry, literary scholar. Though established in the academic world as a scholar of English literature, Elaine Scarry is widely known for her investigations of torture, war, nuclear weapons, and citizenship. Her reading list ranges from Virginia Woolf to aviation, wake, and space technology, and her own work contributes to multiple fields. Her books include the classic The Body in Pain, The Making and Unmaking of the World, On Beauty and Being Just, and Dreaming by the Book. Scarry is the holder of a distinguished professorship at Harvard. Question. Not every professor of English reads aviation, wake, and space technology, and not everyone grapples with pressing human problems of war and torture. Can you tell us something about how you became such an engaged and serious citizen? Elaine Scarry. The thing that should be explained is why people do not read across many fields, rather than why people do. That kind of work across different disciplines is, to my mind, more likely to produce clear thinking. In fact, John Locke, who wrote the Second Treatise of Government, once said, quote, "The purest way to stop thinking is to read books only in one field and talk only to people who work in one field," end quote. Part of the way one continues to think is to look across fields. The reason for that is when you are working within one field, none of the large framing questions are usually disputed or in question. Whereas when you keep passing back and forth across different fields, you have to keep tripping over the threshold of the assumptions in any one field. You are more likely to see perils in them or weaknesses in them as well as strengths, and see some of the large framing questions. Question. What is the value of literature in ethical and political discussions? Elaine Scarry. Brilliant people have written about this, including the philosopher Martha Nussbaum and the philosopher Richard Rorty. Their articles would be well worth reading because rather than starting out as people who read literature, they start as people who are philosophers who then go to literature for models that often accommodate some of the messiness and liquidity of our interactions with one another. There are many different ways of answering that question. We know that there are only a small number of literary works that have themselves brought about large concrete changes. I cite a couple of them in that article on the difficulty of imagining other persons. Uncle Tom's Cabin had huge political consequences for the grave problem of slavery. A more debatable case is A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, which, according to the poet Stephen Spender, overnight caused people in Britain to begin to think of their colonial relation to India very differently than they had before. But using those two pieces of literature would be misleading because they represent exceptional cases where poems and novels really have changed a whole nation's way of perceiving things. Even if we only occasionally come upon works like Uncle Tom's Cabin or A Passage to India that we can watch bringing about a revolution in perception, works of literature that keep us in touch with the beauty of the world always act to bring us into contact with our best selves and to make us opposed to injury. Question. In your article on nuclear double standards, you say that nuclear weapons are inhumane and imply that we should disarm. What would you say to the argument that while the creation of nuclear weapons was obviously not a good thing, now that they do exist, the only way to actually prevent nuclear war is to maintain a huge deterrent? While it may be immoral to keep millions of others under the threat of genocide, and while this may perpetuate asymmetrical notions of otherness, in practice, the threat of mutually assured destruction is the only thing that kept the Cold War from going nuclear, and that maintains baseline geopolitical stability today. Elaine Scarry. I would say that is a completely wrong argument. Nonetheless, it is an argument that more than one smart person has made, so it is perfectly fine that you should raise the issue. But it is absolutely wrong. We can look now at that 1995 International Court of Justice case. Among the many countries that came here asking for a judgment of illegality were India and North Korea, two countries that did not then have nuclear weapons. Is it any surprise that they decided that if the United States and other powers were going to stand there and argue that such weapons are compatible with international law, that using nuclear weapons would not constitute an act of genocide, would not be incompatible with human rights covenants, would not abridge environmental treaties? Is it any wonder that India and North Korea went on to get nuclear weapons? The idea that by having them we deter does not make sense. In an article in The Nation, Jonathan Schell makes the argument, quote, actually the deterrence theory is a pro-proliferation theory, end quote. He does not just pull that sentence out of a hat. He goes through a careful set of steps showing how this thing just keeps mushrooming. Question. You have been involved in helping Ethiopia formulate its constitution. If a newly established state were having a convention to plan its constitution and the people involved wanted you to come and offer some insights from the difficulty of imagining other persons, what questions would you encourage them to think about as they were planning the legal basis for a society? Elaine Scarry. The second thing I would say is something that the ratifiers said when the Constitution of the United States was going out to the states for ratification. You may not realize that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that were so precious to us, that give freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, right against cruel and unusual punishment, right against search and seizure, those things were not in the Constitution until it went out to the ratification assemblies. The ratification assemblies said, wait, we are not signing this unless it makes explicit what the rights are. Finally, it was the state of New York that made it clear that they were not going to go ahead unless these guarantees were made explicit and put in the Constitution. I would say to any new Constitution makers, do not assume that it goes without saying that you have whatever rights are not in there. It has to be said what the rights are. As Patrick Henry said during the ratification debates, quote, what good is it going to do me to say it is an implied right to be free of cruelty when I am in the midst of being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment? End quote. Noam Chomsky, linguist. Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A leading figure in the global justice movement, Chomsky scrutinizes state power and the propaganda system on which it relies. Among his more than 100 books are Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, and Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, with Edward S. Herman. In this interview, Chomsky discusses the origins of his social engagement, the systematic biases of foreign affairs coverage, the recruitment of children in consumerism, and his own sources of hope. Question. Do you believe that universities can be non-political? On a more personal level, how have you yourself negotiated between being faithful to your beliefs and accepting socialization in order to gain the authority you now have as a university professor and renowned political thinker? Noam Chomsky. When I went to Harvard, this university did not look like this. It was well-dressed white males. I went through not only Harvard, but the ultra-socialization sector of Harvard, the Harvard Society of Fellows, where you are socialized into the ways of the elite, how to dress, how to talk, how to walk. No women, of course, in those days, except for the women who served the elegant meals. You can survive it. You have a choice. You do not have to conform to it. Plenty of people did not conform to it. That is why Harvard looks the way it does today. The country was civilized by the activism of the 1960s. That is why the 60s are so hated. And if you take a course about the 60s, they will probably tell you how awful it was. It was awful. It democratized the country. It civilized the country. It raised all kinds of issues that were off the agenda, like women's rights, civil rights, and the environment. A lot of things you were not supposed to think about and did not think about. Election edition. Which is the failed state? Is it Haiti or America? Noam Chomsky. For example, we're having something in November called an election. Suppose someone from Mars was watching this and trying to figure out what was going on. There are two candidates, both of them born to great wealth and political power. Both of them went to the same elite university. Both of them joined the same secret society where they were socialized into the manners and style of the ruling class, and both of them are able to run because they are supported by basically the same narrow concentrations of economic power. Is that an election? By some standards, it is. By others, it would be considered a failed state. But we accept it because we are indoctrinated into accepting it. Unless you do some research, you won't find out that this is by no means universal. Another example is Haiti. Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere. The United States is the richest country in the hemisphere. Haiti is what we call a failed state. The recent period that led to Haiti being a failed state starts in 1990, when Haiti had its first free election. After an awful history, it was taken for granted that the victor in this election would be the U.S. candidate. No one had been paying attention, but in Haiti, a real democratic society had developed of the kind we cannot even imagine. There had been a lot of organizing and activism in the slums and in the hills, where almost all the population lives in extreme poverty. When it got to the point where a lively civil society had developed, they were able to elect their own candidate, a populist priest named Aristide, who came to office in 1991. In the richest country in the hemisphere, that is an unimaginable election. In the poorest country in the hemisphere, they could carry it off. It is interesting to notice what happened and how Haiti descended into becoming a more desperate place than it was. The U.S. was utterly appalled by the election and immediately withdrew its funding to the government and instead diverted the funding to what is called the Democratic Opposition, which is a technical term that means business groups and other groups that want to subordinate the country to the U.S. The U.S. was so appalled by the election that it actually changed its immigration policies. The U.S. had an immigration policy towards Haiti. It was completely illegal and radically in violation of elementary principles of international humanitarian law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The U.S. had Haiti under a blockade that was instituted by President Katha, part of elevating human rights to be the soul of our foreign policy. Haiti was then under the rule of brutal, murderous dictators supported by the U.S., which meant that anyone fleeing Haiti was by definition an economic refugee, not a political refugee, and therefore they were not allowed out of the country. If they made it here, they were sent back. You are not a political refugee if you escape the torture chamber of a dictator that we are supporting. That changed when they had democratic elections. For the first time, the U.S. began accepting refugees as political refugees because they were fleeing from a country that had a democratically elected president. It did not really matter much because not a lot of people were fleeing the country. In fact, the flow was in the other direction. It was a moment of hope, but the official policy was shifted. Well, policy went back to normal in September 1991 when the anticipated military coup took place and a murderous, brutal gang of thugs took power. A military junta supported by a tiny rich elite. Then U.S. policy went back to the norm. From then on, people fleeing became economic refugees again, and they could not get in. The Organization of American States imposed an embargo on Haiti. George Bush I announced right away that the United States was going to violate it. That is, he exempted U.S. firms from the embargo. The New York Times described it as a humanitarian move of what they called fine-tuning the embargo for the benefit of the people of Haiti. In fact, the US trade with Haiti, meaning the junta and the rich elite, continued while the population was being ground in the dust. I was there during the period of the terror, and it was really horrendous. It turned out later that under Clinton, trade increased. It also turned out, though it has yet to be reported outside the business press, that the Clinton administration had authorized the Texaco Oil Company to ship oil to the military junta in violation of presidential directives. Think about it for a moment. Oil is the core part of an embargo. The CIA was reporting regularly to Congress that all flow of oil to Haiti had been stopped. Meanwhile, if you walked around the streets of Port-au-Prince, you could see the oil farms being built by the rich families and the oil tankers in the harbor. Finally, in September 1994, the Clinton administration decided that the population had been tortured enough, and they permitted the elected president to return. There's a phrase for that here. It is called restoring democracy, and we're very proud of it because it shows our commitment to democracy. But what no one bothers to report is that Clinton permitted Aristide to return, but on the condition that he accept the program of the defeated US candidate in the 1990 election. You can return, you can have democracy as long as you do what we tell you and not what the people in the slums and the hills voted for. That is what we call restoring democracy. The program that the Clinton administration imposed on the government as it returned was a very harsh neoliberal program of the kind which Mr. Summers administered in his former life in the Treasury Department. A program which opened Haiti's economy completely to a flow of foreign goods. What does that mean? For example, Haitian rice farmers are very poor, but they are pretty efficient. However, they cannot conceivably compete with exports from U.S. agribusiness, which gets maybe 40% of its profits from subsidies that are given to them by the Reagan administration, in accord with our love of free market. Naturally, as predicted, Haitian rice farmers were wiped out. Now we lament that Haiti somehow cannot feed itself. Big surprise, it is the miracle of the free market. Haiti did have a couple of small industries that were working. For example, the industry of packaging chicken parts was functioning and making some money. It turns out that Americans do not like dark meat, so the big corporations like Tyson have a lot of extra dark meat on their hands, and they would like to dump it somewhere. They tried to dump it on Canada and Mexico, but they did not have democracy restored there, so they were able to impose anti-dumping restrictions. However, Haiti is different. There, thanks to our love for democracy, they cannot stop it. Therefore, chicken parts were dumped on Haiti, and that killed that industry. It was perfectly obvious in 1994 that the program the US was forcing on Haiti was going to destroy what was left of the economy and drive the country into chaos and disruption. That is what happened. It imploded pretty predictably. Bush II made it worse by blocking foreign aid on completely frivolous grounds, but by then, the damage had already been done. If you look at the reporting in the last few weeks, it is all about Haiti, the failed state, where we tried to do nation building because we are so magnificent, and we tried to restore democracy, but they have a bad culture, or maybe bad genes or something, so they just could not handle it and fell apart. Maybe we should go back and try nation building even harder, since it worked so well for the first time. Well, that's Haiti. Who is the failed state again? Is it the state that actually had a democratic election of extremely poor people over terrible odds and managed to elect their own candidate? Or is it the state that crashed it and would not tolerate it and is having an election of the kind we are having in November? Question. How does your research on the negative effects the media can have affect your views on the way that we should raise our children? Noam Chomsky. First of all, if you're well educated, you should not be using the word children. There's a technical term for those small things. They are called, quote, evolving consumers. I'm not joking. In the institution that pretty much runs the country, the public relations industry that serves the business world, which spends maybe $2 trillion on marketing, maybe a sixth of the GDP, it runs elections and it is the core of the media and information systems, they have some principles. One of the principles is to keep the population passive and obedient and marginalized. It was recognized in the 1920s in the more free countries like England and the United States that people have won too much freedom for it to be possible to control them simply by force, the way it had been done in the past. Therefore, you had to control their attitudes and opinions and beliefs, more subtle ways of controlling them. That is when the public relations industry and the advertising business took off. It was frankly called propaganda in those days. The leading figure in the industry wrote a major textbook called Propaganda, which was about how to control people's minds and attitudes to make sure that the enlightened minority, namely us, can run the place without being bothered by the rabble. The rabble will be off doing their own things. They have to be directed to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and you have to impose on them a philosophy of futility, a sense that they really can't do anything, and so they might as well buy shoes. On privatization. Noam Chomsky. Meanwhile, the public schools are underfunded on purpose. If you want to destroy a public school system, what you do is underfund it so that it doesn't work. Then you can say the only answer is privatization, so you hand it over to unaccountable private tyrannies called corporations. They make it even worse, but then what can you do? The British railway system is a perfect example. Our health system is a good example. You underfund the schools, people want out, and you work out various devices like vouchers. Sooner or later, if they get bad enough, people will not want them anymore, and then you will have eliminated the source of democratization and egalitarian development. Question. Who or what has inspired you now and in the past? What keeps you from becoming too disillusioned? Noam Chomsky. The second question is the easiest. Just think about the world 40 years ago and the world today. There's quite a significant change across the board. Attitudes, beliefs, personal behaviors, interactions, the way you dress. Think back to the 60s and what there wasn't. There wasn't a women's movement. There wasn't an environmental movement. There was virtually no anti-war movement. That came in the late 60s after years and years of war. There was no third world solidarity movement, no global justice movement. All sorts of things that are part of our lives just didn't exist. These things have come over the last 40 years because people aren't willing to become disillusioned. Either you can say, I gave up, in which case you can be sure the worst thing is going to happen, or you can say, okay, I'm going to be committed to trying to make things better and make things better. So there's nothing to be disillusioned about. As to what's inspiring, it's the way people struggle. You see it all over the world. I recently went to both Turkey, including Kurdish areas, and Colombia, two countries that are very high on the list of violence and atrocities, and also happen to be, not by accident, the two leading recipients of US military aid, aside from Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. The people are not giving up. Turkish and Colombian intellectuals don't ask, what can I do? Writers, journalists, artists, and academic figures are constantly carrying out protests. In Colombia, they get their heads blown off. In Turkey, they can get sent to Turkish prisons for years or much of their lives for telling what's going on. They're not giving up. Just like campesinos and indigenous people and Afro-Colombians who are being driven off their lands by chemical warfare and fumigation with US aid and US military forces. But they're not complaining. They're constantly protesting. Robert Reich, political scholar. In 2003, he won the Vaclav Havel Prize, awarded annually to a person whose work has significantly addressed fundamental problems of humanity. He's the author of 10 books, including the most recent, Reason, Why Liberals Will Win the Battle for America. In this interview, Reich discusses the ethics and economics of the global marketplace and grassroots politics, never losing sight of the common good. On taking politics seriously. Robert. I should say that I approached this class with some trepidation, because in the sister course we were talking about politics, personal choice, personal efficacy, and the ability to feel that you can actually have an effect on your society. Somehow, during the course of that session, I got into my head that I should run for the governor of Massachusetts, and I lost. So just be careful what you say. Anything could happen in this session. Let me urge every one of you, at some point in your life, you do not have to run for governor, to take electoral politics very seriously. If because of cynicism or resignation, you decide that politics is somebody else's business, you're ceding the political arena to the other guys. I have said this before. Politics is the applied form of democracy. Unless we understand it and practice it and take it seriously and really be part of the political process, we are not effectively utilizing our power in this democracy. and we are not experiencing what this democracy is really about. On grassroots campaigning in elections that are won based on money. Robert, in Massachusetts and other states, it is still possible to have a ground war through grassroots organizing and to run a campaign that is based upon both the internet and people talking to each other. I went around this state, town by town, city by city, and spoke at town meetings. I think if I had done it for another year, I might have won. I did not have the money, but I did spend 5 hours a day on the telephone calling everybody I could think of, asking them to contribute money to my campaign so that I could have a little bit of an air war. But the winner, Mitt Romney, ultimately spent $12 million, and something like 4, 5, or 6 million of the 12 million came from his own pocket. We cannot have a democracy that is dominated by rich people who are basically paying for themselves. Nor can we have a democracy that is basically run by big companies and even big labor or any big organization that are financing campaigns. Now, where does that leave you? Where it leaves you is if you want to be involved in politics at the grassroots, there is still plenty of room. Even California, I would not give up on. I think we have got to revive grassroots politics in this country. I think that is the only way of combating these air wars unless we get campaign finance reform, clean elections reform, and some public financing of air war campaigns. But that is no replacement for grassroots campaigning. Question. Could you say a bit more about the experience of your gubernatorial campaign? For many of us, you struck us as a person of enormous hope, someone who would keep going on no matter how badly things went. What does it feel like to be in electoral politics for the first time and see the way that large amounts of money can bulldoze ordinary citizens who are trying to make a difference? How did you maintain hope? Robert, how many of you have taken an introductory economics course? What microeconomics leaves out is that we carry around in our heads aspirations for the common good. It is not only aspirations for what we want for ourselves, but we also have ideals about what is good for our society, what is good for the world. These aspirations, whether we call them the public interest, the common good, or something else, are the stuff of which politics really should be made. And you can tap into them. The best thing about being a politician was traveling around Massachusetts. In fact, even when I was in Bill Clinton's cabinet, traveling around the country and talking to people, we talked only about their own needs, healthcare, childcare, better school, pension reform, but also their aspirations for what other people needed. I remember when we tried to raise the minimum wage in 1995 or 1996 for the first time in years, most people in Washington told me, there is no way you're going to get public support for this because the minimum wage touches just a small fragment of the workforce. It is an old democratic thing nobody cares about. Well, it turns out that 85% of Americans thought the minimum wage ought to be raised. Many of them felt very passionate about it. We steamrolled a Republican Congress because they had so much mail from so many people saying this is the only right and decent thing to do. If you want to get into politics, people want to hear aspirations about the common good. People also want to behold and vote for somebody who has integrity. Juliet Schor. As an economist, Juliet Schor has focused public attention on a trend that many Americans know from personal experience: overwork. Her best-selling book, The Overworked America and the Unexpected Decline of Leisure, finds that Americans now spend more hours working than at any time since World War II. In this interview, Schor paints a vivid portrait of a consumer society fueled by advertising that leaves many overworked Americans feeling depressed. She describes alternative policies that would offer workers more choice as well as her own efforts to limit the market's influence on her children. Question. While people in the US become increasingly overworked, there seems to be a pressing need to help those struggling at the very bottom. How do you think people gain a sense of social responsibility? What personal experiences have given you a sense of this social responsibility? Juliet. The dominant approach out there when it comes to issues of social responsibility is service and volunteering, coming out of traditions of noblesse oblige, the duty of the wealthy to help the poor. There are also traditions that address these issues from the point of view of doing what is socially just, in which each of us has our own obligation or role in terms of making society a more just and ethical place. It is this second tradition that I personally believe in and that I worry is being crowded out by the first. The thing about the first is that it essentially leaves structures of privilege in place. It says in a world in which some people have so much, it is their duty to give a little more to the people below. It does not question the basic structures that lead to extremes of privilege and deprivation. Question: why did you decide to research neo-consumerism? Was there a moment during your youth or education that significantly raised your concern about it? Juliet: when I came to Harvard in 1984, I had a standard economist's view about consumption issues, which was that more is better. It's a simple story. We should grow as fast as we can, and we can solve environmental problems through technology. Also, as a radical economist coming out of a Marxian economic tradition, I focused more on production. Historically, Marxists have tended not to think too much about consumption, particularly in fields of economics. I ended up completely revising my views and arriving at a very different point of view after first researching the workplace. My book, The Overworked American, is almost all about the workplace, the pressure on workers to work longer, and why people were not getting more leisure time. Despite incredible growth of productivity in our society, what I found as I started looking at the data was that workers were actually working longer hours. That left an interesting question about the income that people were getting and what they were doing with it, and why in surveys asking workers about the trade-off between money and free time, most people said they pretty much liked what they had and did not show dissatisfaction about hours of work. What I started to do was examine the spending side of it, because I thought that must be important in understanding why people are satisfied with the fact that they are working longer hours. I developed what I called the model of work and spend. What I found out was that people's preference about money and consumption adapt to what is happening in their lives. When surveys asked workers if they would rather have a raise or more free time, very large numbers of workers said they preferred the free time, but the system did not give that to them, giving income instead. They spent the income and became habituated to that kind of spending. When pollsters would go back a year or two later and ask the same question, people would again say they were happy with what they had. I argue that that happened again and again in the post-World War II era. This is the total reverse of the standard argument, which says people have preferences for consumption. They exercise those in the market and get what they want. The standard argument also says that the number of hours people work is a reflection of their preferences, so they are choosing the hours they work and are again getting just what they want. What I argue is that the system works in reverse. Workers end up wanting what they have, so their preferences adapt to what is out there in the labor market. Given that there's a lot of rigidity in the system, workers have not had the opportunity to trade off productivity growth against leisure time. This relatively simple model just scratched the surface of the issue of consumption. Question: in the news, we often hear consumerism linked with a better economy. For instance, during holiday shopping season. Do you feel that is an accurate interpretation that consumer spending is the foundation of a healthy economy? What do you think motivates this depiction on news coverage? Juliet: there's a difference between the possibilities for an economy and the way the US economy is currently structured. It is true that in recent years especially, we have shifted much more to a consumer-driven economy, and in particular, a debt-driven economy. A lot of that consumer spending is happening because of debt. People work longer hours in part so they can pay debts and keep up with these lifestyles. We have more and more activity and personnel devoted to marketing and advertising, with increasing dollars going in that direction. People may remember after September 11th when President Bush came out and said that the thing people could do to be real patriots was to go to the mall and shop. By the way, people did not respond to this message for many reasons, one of which is that many Americans have a tremendous amount of debt. Particularly with the economy crashing, they did not feel comfortable going out and adding more debt to their credit cards. When people like myself and organizations like the Center for a New American Dream talk about issues concerning the relationship between consumerism and the economy, our view is that there's a precariousness to this form of economy and it has negative impacts we want to avoid, environmental impacts being central among them. Also, if you think about what has happened in this period that I call new consumerism, which refers to the last 20 years, especially since the 1990s, increasingly you have money going towards luxury and status consumption and away from the satisfaction of people's basic needs. We have an increasing number of people who do not have health insurance or access to good health care. We have our school budgets being cut all around the country. We are shifting away from things like education, healthcare, social services, high quality food, as opposed to cheap fast food. These are all things research tells us would do much more to give people well-being. As a result, critics say we need to change the foundations of the economy. It is not so much about spending less, it is about spending differently. Our economy has been on the path of the maximal rate of growth, of which much of that is consumption. There are plenty of examples of other economies in which private consumption is a smaller fraction of total economic activity. Let's say people agreed with me and wanted to do less of this private consumption. If we tried to cut back or to change, wouldn't the economy collapse? People worry a lot about that. With the message that I am giving, people say, wait a second, how can we have a healthy economy if people consume less? There are two ways to think about that. If every person in this country cut up all his or her credit cards tomorrow and decided to live with much more modest consumer spending, there is no question that we would have an economic collapse. But that is an unrealistic vision of how it would actually happen. The transformation would occur gradually and largely because people decide they want to opt for more time out of the labor market and less money and therefore have to spend less since they're not going to be earning as much. If you have a gradual shift to shorter hours of work and downsizing in the labor market, you can actually shift to a different kind of economy without chaos and unemployment. Rather than urge people to go to the mall and buy more stuff that they do not really need, we should have taken the opportunity after 9/11 to pull together as a country and ask what other things we in this country really need, to which we would devote time, energy, and money. That to me would have been more patriotic and more like what happened after the Second World War. We need to rebuild schools. We need to fix our healthcare system. We need to fix our foster care system. We need to clean up our environment. These are urgent needs in this country. These are the needs to which we can devote time and money that will give us more well-being. Question: how do you respond to your critics' claim that there seems to be an American cultural preference for income over leisure in terms of the willingness to work overtime? By what grounds do you quantify or measure quality of life and arrive at the conclusion that Europeans have it better than we do? Juliet, is it just a cultural phenomenon that Americans are long-hour workers? A very short time horizon might give you that point of view, but if you look 50 years back, after the Second World War, the US had much shorter working hours than Europe. We eliminated Saturday work and went to a 40-hour standard work week long before Europe did. That mostly had to do with the fact that our GNP was growing faster in the early part of the century. We were getting wealthier quicker. You can see the same thing with Japan. When I started doing this research, Japan was the world's workaholic nation. We have now surpassed Japan in terms of working hours. There was a lot of talk about how overwork was deep in the Japanese psyche and culture, which would not allow them to work shorter hours. However, decades earlier, the stereotype of the Japanese was that they were a never-do-well, lazy culture. We have to be careful about culture and ascribing too much to it, particularly when we're seeing very big changes in working hours in very short periods of time. Those are probably not going to be caused by culture shifts or cultural determinants. The more important factors have to do with some of the economic factors that are driving hours of work. One is the way in which employers have pushed the norm to higher work hours. Surveys looking at changes in work over the last 25 years show that employees report not only working many more hours, but also the intensity of work has increased. The expansion of work into private time has increased. There are some very specific driving factors for this in the US. For example, the demise of the trade union movement, which was the key driver of shorter hours of work before World War II. Unions are still a major factor in Europe, which explains why European working hours have fallen and American working hours have turned around. There is also no doubt that there is a history in this country of the so-called Protestant work ethic and that the US has been consumerist leading the world in the development of mass consumerist culture. On the harm of materialist values. Juliet. Working long hours, watching a lot of television, shopping a lot, having materialist values, those things do not contribute very much to well-being. In some cases, they undermine well-being. For example, let's take consumerist values. There is now very extensive literature in psychology which shows that the more materialist you are, the more you care about accumulating stuff, the more you care about making money, the more priority you give to possessions and financial success over other things, the worse off you are. You are more likely to be depressed. You are more likely to be anxious. You will have lower self-esteem. You're also more likely to have stomachaches, headaches, and psychosomatic illnesses. You will have less of what psychologists call life vitality. There is a lot of literature on adolescents and adults that shows this. Consumerist values are just not a healthy value system. I have just completed analysis on middle school children, asking similar kinds of questions, measuring how involved they are in consumer culture, how much they care about having stuff and labels, and how much television they watch. Then I took measures of their well-being, such as their levels of anxiety and depression, how often they get stomachaches and headaches, how bored they are, what they think of their parents, and their levels of self-esteem. All of those psychological outcomes are adversely affected by involvement in consumer culture. The kids who are more into this culture score lower on all those psychological measures. An underlying causal model shows that it is their involvement in consumer culture that causes all of those things. It is not the other way around where screwed up kids gravitate towards consumer culture. Here's one more point on that. Research also shows that the more television and other forms of media you watch, the more consumer involved you are. Children who watch a lot of TV and other media are more likely to care about money, stuff, and labels, and to worry about how much they have relative to other people. That, by the way, is key here. One of the real secrets to well-being is not to worry about having less than other people. The more oriented you are to comparing yourself to others, the lower you're going to score on all of these outcome variables, more depression and anxiety, and lower self-esteem. I found this in a lot of research that I have done in different areas. Naomi Klein, journalist. Once a self-described mall rat with an eye for design and labels, Naomi Klein today is a critic of corporate power and a leading light of the global justice movement. In 2000, Klein published her celebrated book, No Logo, taking aim at the brand bullies. Her book, Fences and Windows, dispatches from the front lines of the globalization debate, tracks the globalization conflict from Seattle to September 11th and beyond. In this interview, Klein discusses campus activism, the North American way of life, and her role as an activist journalist in the anti-corporate movement. On the American way of life, Naomi Klein. But we do need to understand our complicity. I am going to Iraq in a couple of days, and my intention behind that trip is very clearly to shine a light on what occupying powers in Iraq are doing and our complicity in that. At the same time, it is really important that when we talk about things like overconsumption and the role of the US in the world, that we also look at the promises of its lifestyle and whether it is actually making us happy. Our war fought in part over oil relates to the kind of isolated lives we live here, as well as to climate change, from which no one is excluded. Arundhati Roy often asks people whether the so-called American way of life, a way of life so sacred and supposedly so wonderful that the government wages war around the world to protect it, actually makes them happy. She jokingly describes the American way of life as the right to live alone in your house with your washing machine, and when you put it that way, it doesn't sound worth waging wars to protect. A couple of years ago, I was speaking at an American campus right after living in Argentina for a year, researching the economic crisis. I went straight from Buenos Aires to a university in Colorado. A young woman stood up to ask the first question. She said, "I understand what you're saying about Washington's neoliberal economic policies on Argentina, and I know it's really, really bad. But the problem is, we do not really care because we are comfortable." She said, "I have my own car, and I drive to Walmart and to McDonald's, to school, and I am happy. So why should we care?" There are a lot of ways that you can deconstruct that whole exchange. But what really struck me was what she was describing. Driving to Walmart and McDonald's and driving to school, living from strip mall to strip mall, actually did not sound that much fun. A lot of what we keep being told is this wonderful way of life that we have to protect is sometimes pretty bleak and lonely, which is why there are so many people on Prozac and other antidepressants. Question. Your articles are obviously very opinionated and offer a particular view of politics. What do you believe to be your role as a journalist, and how should you be informing society's opinion about politics? Naomi Klein. I consider myself an activist journalist. I identify myself primarily as an activist, as someone who is driven by my desire for social change. But I happen to actually not like crowds very much. There are a lot of different ways of being an activist. We have this idea in our head that activist equals someone who marches in a rowdy crowd, holds a placard, and screams into a megaphone. That is an activist. You can be an activist in any profession that you choose. You can be an activist doctor, an activist lawyer, an activist entrepreneur, and an activist journalist. It means that you use your skills and talents in the service of social change. That does not mean that you would never go to a protest. I certainly go to protests and rallies, but I am not a very good chanter. I am a columnist, which means that my role is to have an opinion and to analyze from a certain perspective. There are people whose job is to be a straight-ahead reporter, and they have to be much more guided by the rules of balance. I do not use the word objectivity because I do not believe that anyone is objective. Absolutely, you must be fair and balanced, and you must not be a propagandist. You can't be a journalist out of your desire for social justice, but you should refuse to be a propagandist in the sense of distorting reality for those political ends. Propaganda does not actually serve those political ends. Question. In Fences and Windows, you write of the recurring theme of fences acting as barriers to resources, demonstration, political policies, and other means of effecting change. When have you personally felt the burden of such a fence blocking you from implementing change? How did you respond to this? Naomi Klein. I chose the metaphor of fences because in many countries the only jobs available are as prison guards or as private security guards protecting the haves from the have-nots. We barely notice it anymore because so many of us have accepted the realities of our widening gap between the rich and the poor. But that kind of system means that the rich have to be protected from the rage of the poor, from the mobility of the poor, and from the needs of the poor, which is why we have so many fences and walls in our supposedly globalized society. This holds whether at the border, where we're seeing more and more people being deported in handcuffs, or at the neighborhood level, with ever more elaborate alarm systems, especially in cities like Sao Paulo, New Delhi, or Johannesburg, where you have the sharpest divisions. That was why I used that metaphor. One of the reasons this passage really stuck out to me, when it comes to fences that sort of lock us in and keep other people out, is when it comes to the current protests in Kenya, is our president's self-imposed house arrest that he has since lifted, but it was quite there for a while. During the protests, he locked himself in State House, barricaded all the roads leading to State House, and people could not use any of those roads. And it's essentially what the rich have to do. They have to barricade themselves from the poor, needing all of this protection. And it's what the wicked also have to do, the people in power who are doing all kinds of, terrible shit, just destroying our futures. And it's what they also have to do. And I cannot wait for him to have to barricade himself inside State House again. Ruto must go. Question. In Fences and Windows, you describe how the anti-globalization movement is the moral stepchild of globalization. In other words, the same connections fostered by globalization also led to a transfer of information between people in various parts of the world who are opposed to globalization. As an outgrowth of globalization itself, which you describe as perpetuating unequal distributions in wealth and power, to what extent Does the anti-globalization campaign reproduce the same imbalance? To what extent is the campaign dominated by Western voices? Finally, as a journalist, how do you try to incorporate the voices of people in regions of the world who are at the other end of the wealth, power, and privilege spectrum? Naomi Klein. I say in the foreword to the book that calling it an anti-globalization movement is a misnomer. There are some people who are against globalization. They think that we should all just stay home and grow our own food. These people exist, but they are a very small minority within what is called the anti-globalization movement. The vast majority of people who galvanized around this movement were driven by the rise of corporate power and the privatization of life. In fact, in many parts of the world, nobody uses terms like anti-globalization to describe this movement. In Latin America, for instance, they are anti-capitalists, or they are reacting to neoliberalism. It is an anti-neoliberal movement. For the past 5 years, Latin America has rejected these policies in many different ways, stopping privatization everywhere from Bolivia to Mexico, and kicking out neoliberal presidents in Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil. They're not saying we do not want to be a part of the global economy. Rather, they are rejecting a set of economic policies that they call neoliberalism, the policies of privatization, deregulation, and downsizing. The reason why it is globalization is because these policies are global and they are globally enforced by international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. One-size-fits-all cookie-cutter models. The most famous example of this was when the IMF went into Russia. A journalist got a copy of one of their structural adjustment documents where they talk about how Russia had to privatize all of their state enterprises and eliminate all import tax. In the middle of the document, the journalist saw that it said South Korea instead of Russia because they did some kind of search and replace but missed a couple. When I say it is one size fits all, it is literally the same recipe taken from South Korea and imposed on Russia and now imposed in Iraq. These policies they're using when they are imposed all at once are called shock therapy. That is what they called it in the former Soviet Union, and that is what they are calling it in Iraq. But it is shock therapy imposed through shock and awe in military form. Do not ask permission, just bomb and then take. It is a willful act to refuse to use the word globalization in a movement that is actually rejecting neoliberalism, or what the French call savage capitalism. It is a response to global economic policy, not globalization. It is not the fact of being global that is the problem. It is the policies that are the problem and the fact that they are globally enforced. So people started to respond not just with nationalist solutions, but also with international social forums like the one in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where people come together and talk about international strategies to respond to these global policies. Of course, we have to be global because they are global, but I do not see that as an irony. Lani Guinier, legal scholar, the first Black woman to become a tenured professor at Harvard Law School, co-author of The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, Transforming Democracy. In this interview, Guinier reminds us that standardized tests more accurately predict the kind of car a student's parents drive than what grades that student will earn during the first year of college. Using race as a diagnostic tool, she teaches about the miner's canary and encourages us to enlarge our vision of what democracy means, of what the women's movement might be, and of the mission of higher education. Question: in light of the women's movement's historical blindness on issues of race and class, would you share your vision of what you would like to see the women's movement in the United States doing today and how it should interact with international women's groups? Lani. Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman professor who teaches both at UCLA and Columbia, has written an important article on issues of intersectionality, in which she talks about the relationship of white women to people of color, to race. One of her points is that we need to think about race and we need to think about gender, each as coalitions in and of themselves. That is, the women's movement needs to be reconceptualized as a coalition of people who are committed to issues of equity in terms of gender. When you think of the women's movement itself as a coalition, it is not just based on an essential identity named woman. Because when you think about woman, most people, at least in the United States, think about white women. They think about white upper middle class women, and then that becomes the defining paradigm for the movement. But if you think about the movement as itself being grounded in the notion of coalition, then the question is, who are these white upper middle class women in coalition with? And what are they in coalition to do? The same thing is true with race. When you think about race and the black community, you should think about the black community as a coalition between black women and black men. That is a way of both understanding the important elements of a community while also keeping in mind that you create a coalition in order to do something, in order to serve or promote a vision. So it is not just based on who you are, but what you do. I think that using this idea of coalition would be an interesting way of reconceptualizing the women's movement. My experience is that the group that is most associated with the women's movement, meaning upper middle class white women, in some ways has been paralyzed in terms of how to conceptualize the future of this movement. If you take, for example, many women at Harvard Law School, they do not want to talk about gender at all. They do not want to talk about gender because they are afraid that when you speak of gender, you are confirming stereotypes. They have assumed that there is no relevant difference between men and women. That is the way they have been taught, socialized to think about these issues, and yet men still outperform women in law school and in making partner, and women are still underrepresented on the faculty. There was an interesting book about 15 years ago about women as prisoners of men's dreams, meaning that the women's movement is seeking to obtain what men have, as if what men have is the ultimate ideal, as opposed to suggesting that men could also learn from the experience of women. The goal is to reconceptualize the ideal society, not in the image of men, not in the image of women, but in the image of all the members of this coalition. It requires that you denaturalize some of the assumptions as to what success is, what merit is, what privilege is, which have been, in my opinion, gendered male, certainly at the law school, and begin to question what it means to have success. Many women at law school now determine their own position vis-a-vis success as, are they doing as well as the men? As opposed to, is anybody in law school doing what it takes to become a good lawyer in the 21st century? Are we teaching all our students to become public and private problem solvers? Going back to your question, many women feel that rather than questioning the dominant paradigm, they just have to succeed within it. It is what we call in the miner's canary, climbing backwards up the cheese grater, repopulating the hierarchy by trying to make it to the top. If you have ever grated cheese on a cheese grater, you will know that what is left in your hand after you have been grating is a bare nubbin of what you used to have. Oftentimes, when you climb backwards up that cheese grater, you're grating off all the things that motivated you to want to succeed in the first place, and who you are becomes indistinguishable from the people that you're presumably trying to replace. Question. If you were invited to make a speech before the Supreme Court with respect to its deliberation on affirmative action, how would you either defend or reject the policy? What are your objections to and points of agreement with the alternative offered by its opponents, basing admissions not on racial diversity but on economic diversity? Lani, I would try to get the court to focus first on what the public mission of higher education is in this country. When we think about affirmative action, we tend to start the conversation talking about admission to institutions of higher education. At least it is in that context that the issue is before the court right now in terms of the University of Michigan College and law school cases. We treat the issue as if it is simply a matter of who should be admitted to these selective institutions. That is starting the conversation in the wrong place. The conversation needs to start with the mission of these institutions. And then once you have an understanding of that mission, you can strategize back to understand what admission policies are appropriate to promote the mission of higher education. The conversation about affirmative action should not take place simply as a question of admission, linking it to mission, but it should also be a conversation that opens up questions about institutional practice, because that too should be a function of the mission of the institution. Just as an aside, in terms of the Michigan case, which was argued on April 1st, 2003, there were briefs filed as friends of the court by a number of ex-generals and former heads of the military academy, which are now called the military brief. And there were briefs filed again as friends of the court by some of the Fortune 500 companies. What was interesting is that both the military and the business briefs did exactly what I am proposing. That is, they started with their mission. The military started with its mission of protecting the country's national security, and then concluded that having an admission policy that enabled them to recruit a diverse set of potential leaders was essential to their mission, because the legitimacy of the institution depended upon having diversity throughout the ranks in order to avoid some of the fragmentation and communication bottlenecks that occurred during the Vietnam War, when there was a predominantly black and Latino group of soldiers and then virtually all white officers commanding the forces. There was a disconnect between who was fighting the war and who was making decisions or leadership judgments, and that undermined military effectiveness. Therefore, when the former generals talked about affirmative action, it was clearly linked to the mission of the organization. Business followed the same progression. Now, we could take issue with what the business community or even the military were articulating as their mission, but at least they were starting by talking about missions. When we talk about affirmative action in the context of higher education, instead of talking about the mission of higher education, we talk about what is fair to individuals who have applied to institutions of higher education. We do not talk about the fact that most institutions of higher education have a public democratic mission. Obviously, Michigan, which is a public institution subsidized by all of the taxpayers, has a public democratic mission since it is a public school. But even private schools have public missions because, first of all, education is an essential part of a democracy. In a democracy, we depend on the capacity of citizens to deliberate, to participate, to be involved in decision making. In order to do that, the assumption is that people need to be educated. But in addition, institutions of higher education, even private institutions, are networking opportunities for potential leaders. They are gatekeepers. This also relates to the question of democracy, because the assumption is that you need to have a representative group of leaders in order to have a legitimate democracy. Now, if we had that conversation and we concluded that having democratic diversity was critical to the mission of higher education, we would have a very different kind of conversation about the kinds of admission protocol that would be appropriate to promote that democratic mission. In my view, that kind of democratic mission requires diversity, not just racial diversity, but also socioeconomic diversity. The problem I have with the present framing, in which we are either for or against affirmative action, is that conversation is taking place almost exclusively on the margins. For example, the majority of people who are getting admitted are not at the center of the conversation. And they should be. There was a recent study by Tony Carnival, a vice president of the Educational Testing Service, who found that of the 146 most selective colleges and universities in this country, 74% of the students come from the richest socioeconomic demographic. That is, 74% of the students at the 146 most selective colleges and universities are in the top 25% of the income distribution. Only 3% of all the students at those schools are in the bottom 25%. If you add together the bottom two quartiles, then you have only 10% of the students at the 146 most selective colleges and universities. There's a tremendous, what Carnival calls, machine of inequality that is at work that should be at the forefront of the conversation. A small group of very affluent students dominate admission. Assuming that higher education has a democratic mission, why are we practicing democracy, which is supposed to be about all of the people, in a way that allows the elite to dominate these opportunities not only for upward mobility, but for potential leadership? Question. In the miner's canary, you talk about the need for fundamental change in the power structures of our society, both cultural and political. What do you think the role of someone such as a white male from a relatively privileged background is in enacting that change? Or am I, by nature of my background, my class, my race, and my gender, just part of the problem and powerless as far as what I can do? Learning. One of the concepts that we talk about in the Miner's Canary is political race. The idea of political race starts with the premise that we can learn a lot from those who have been left out and who have been marginalized because of their racial identity. You can make a similar claim in terms of those who have been left out based on gender, based on disability, or based on sexual orientation. That is the whole point of the metaphor of the canary and the mine. The canary was the diagnostic resource for the miners who would bring this canary into the mines to alert them when the atmosphere was too toxic for the miners. The canary had a more fragile respiratory system, which when it gave away was a signal to the miners that there was a problem with the atmosphere in the mines. The argument that we are making with political race is that the experience of people of color is the experience of the canary. Oftentimes, the way in which we conventionally think about race is that we see things converging around people of color. We see problems that we associate with people of color and we pathologize the canary. We assume that because this is happening to people of color and we see it, that it must be a problem of those people. The idea of political race is to try to create a sense of connection between the miners and the canary. In fact, your future rests with a better understanding of what is happening to the canary, and you cannot survive even if you are affluent, even if you are white, even if you are male, if you are living in a toxic environment. In that sense, your liberation is bound up with the saving of the canary. So there is a sense in which we start with race as the diagnostic tool. We also start with race because we have seen that those who have been left out not only have a perspective that others may not initially appreciate. This is the claim that if you are a fish swimming in water, you may not notice that there is water, and it is only somebody who is less comfortable in the environment that may notice there is H2O. Our argument is that in a culture that often neglects the importance of community in favor of the radical individual, we need to listen to the critique offered by the canary, and we need to heed the warning signs from those people who have been left out. These canaries are often the people who have a sense of community, a sense of linked fate, a sense that they are not alone, because their very survival depends on being connected to other similarly situated individuals. Political race is both a diagnostic tool and a resource of solidarity and community, and the goal is to mobilize those two assets to create a social movement that also brings other people into the movement, because it is moving towards a shared vision, not just fixing the canary, but fixing the atmosphere and the minds. Let me give you an example of how this has happened in real life. Before the University of Michigan case raised the stakes on affirmative action and the use of race in making admission decisions, the Fifth Circuit ruled that race could not be a factor in admission decisions in the 1990s. In response, a group of canary watchers at the University of Texas were determined to ensure that Texas, the flagship school of the University of Texas at Austin, remained accessible to Black and Latinos for a number of reasons related to what I said earlier, but also because the University of Texas had officially discriminated against Blacks and Latinos for much of its history. The infamous Sweat versus Painter case came out of the University of Texas. The group of canary watchers understood that Blacks and Latinos often did not do as well on the conventional tests that are used to allocate scarce resources in the state's higher education system. There are many more people, not only who want to go to UT Austin, but who could do the work at UT Austin. Because of shifts in resources from education to prison, there is less money available now to fund public education to meet the demand. You have more and more people who want to go to college, and you have fewer seats. In order to distribute these resources, these scarce slots efficiently, meaning without putting a lot of resources into the administration of the admission program, schools like the University of Texas, the University of Michigan, even Harvard, which could put their resources in if it wanted, rely on the SAT the LSAT, the GRE, the MCAT, to do a lot of the sorting for them. You might say that makes sense because these tests are a good measure of merit. They're going to tell us who is going to do well, not only at the school, but also in the future. That is not in fact correct. The Canary Watchers in Texas discovered that the tests are actually a pretty poor predictor of what you are going to do in life, and not much better in predicting how well you're going to do your first year in college. In fact, Harvard did a study of 3 classes of its graduates over a 30-year period and found that 2 things predict success as Harvard measures it. When they were doing this study, I am guessing now, I do not know this to be a fact, I assume that they were looking to see who made a lot of money, who had a lot of fun making the money, and who was giving the money back to the school. Those were their measures of success. How much money do you make? How much do you enjoy your career? Have you become a leader in your community to the point where you now want to include your college in your charitable donations? 2 things correlated with success, as Harvard defined it: low ACT scores and a blue-collar background. The conclusion seemed to be that if you are given the opportunity to go to a prestigious university and you are motivated to take advantage of that opportunity, you may in fact better use that opportunity than those people who feel entitled to be there. Michigan found that in a 30-year sample of its law school graduates, those with the highest entry-level credentials were no more likely to do well financially. During one period, 1980 to 1989, those with the highest entry-level credentials were among those who did not enjoy their career. That is, if you had high entry-level credentials, you were certainly no more likely to have job satisfaction. Significantly, those with the highest entry-level credentials were among those who were least likely to contribute to the community after they graduated. They were the least likely to mentor younger attorneys, to do public service, to do pro bono work, or to become leaders in their community, to give back, in other words, to the community that subsidized their education in the first place. One of the hypotheses of the authors of the Michigan study is that the testing regime, what I call the testocracy, undermines people's understanding of why they are coming to an institution of higher education. It communicates the wrong message. It tells people that you deserve to be here, and therefore you have no obligation to give back to anybody. You are here to do well, but not necessarily to do good. The Canary Watchers at Texas, who were looking at all of this data, and similar data was also true at Texas, found that at the college level in particular, these tests, which are not predicting performance long-term, actually do correlate with something. Peter Sachs has recently clarified what that something is. These tests allow you to predict what kind of car someone's parents drive. He calls it the Volvo effect. If you know someone's test score, you're better able to predict their parents' wealth than you are to predict their first-year college grades. With Michelle Fine and Jane Ballan, I did a study at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where we got all of the LSAT scores of all of the students over a 4-year period, and we found that if you knew someone's LSAT, you could predict their first-year law school grades 14% of the time, which means that 86% of the time, you would be wrong. Nationwide, the LSAT is 9% better than random in predicting law school grades. Yet there's a stronger relationship between ACT scores and grandparent wealth than between ACTs or LSAT scores and first-year grades. Because of this correlation with affluence rather than aptitude, you have the situation I referred to before, where 74% of the seats at these highly selective institutions are going to the 25% richest people in the United States. In Texas, the Canary Watchers were using race as a diagnostic tool. They understood that people of color were not doing as well on these tests, and they were concerned about the fact that if you just relied on these tests without considering race, they would have a predominantly white institution in a state that is becoming increasingly people of color. They then looked to see which high schools were feeding into the selective college, their flagship schools. There are approximately 1,500 high schools in Texas, and 150 of those schools were providing 75% of the freshman students. 10% of the high schools of Texas dominated access to this public institution that was subsidized by all of the taxpayers of the state. That 10%, those high schools were from suburban Dallas, suburban Houston, suburban Austin. They then found that grades in high school are the best predictor of grades in college, if that is all you're interested in. I happen to think that that is a thin measure, what Carnival calls skinny merit, when you use just one idea, one concept, one test to determine merit. But if you're only going to use one thing, then grades in high school are a better predictor of your college success than your ACT scores. They came up with the idea of creating the opportunity for people in the top 10% of any high school throughout the state to attend the flagship school. So, if you were in the top 10% of a high school from San Antonio or in the top 10% of a high school in a depressed area of Houston, you would still be automatically eligible for admission to the University of Texas at Austin. They put this bill before the Texas legislature. They started with race as their diagnostic tool, but by the time they got to the Texas legislature, they needed allies. They were looking for coalition partners. Not all of the people, by the way, who were involved in the initial research were Black or Latino. At the time, the head of the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund in Texas, Al Kaufman, was a white man. When they got this bill before the Texas legislature, it passed by one vote. That one vote was cast by a white, Republican, conservative legislator who represented a district in rural West Texas. He voted for the 10% plan because the Canary Watchers were able to show him that under the testocracy, not a single one of his constituents had been admitted to the University of Texas for many of the previous 10 years. They built a coalition between blacks and Latinos who were being excluded, and working class and poor rural whites who were being excluded by an admission regime that was preferring affluence to a more robust notion of merit. The 10% plan has been in effect now for what will be 5 years in June 2003. 50% of the class at the University of Texas at Austin comes in through the 10% plan. 50% of the class still comes in based on ACT scores, teacher recommendations, and the same kinds of things that you think got you into Harvard. Of the students who come in pursuant to the 10% plan, whether they went to a resource-starved school or a very well-endowed school, whether they are white, black, Latino, or Asian, if they come in under the 10% plan, they have a higher freshman GPA at the University of Texas at Austin than those students who are still coming in under the testocracy. The 10%ers, in other words, are outperforming in college those students who are coming in under conventional credentials. The students with the highest persistence rate, students who not only come in as freshmen but who then return as sophomores, are black women. The point is that you start with race because it is a diagnostic tool. You start with race because people of color who have been left out are often the most committed to collective action to make a change. But you use that commitment to collective struggle to create a vision that others can follow. This is what has happened in Texas because the 10% plan has opened up opportunity. It is not as carefully targeted to blacks as affirmative action was. That is, the percentage of blacks now at the University of Texas at Austin is about 3.8%. When they used affirmative action, it was 4%. The percentage of Mexican Americans, however, is high. The percentage of working class whites is high still. I'm not saying that the 10% plan is a panacea. I'm not saying that it is a substitute for affirmative action. But I am saying that it is a more transformative way of understanding the role of affirmative action. Thinking experimentally about admission in the context of mission, keeping the democratic mission of public institutions in mind, and watching the canary can open up opportunity for the minors as well. The story of the Texas 10% plan shows that it does not so much matter what your personal race or identification is, but whether you link your fate with the people of color who have been left out. Katha Pollitt, writer, is best known for her incisive analysis of politics, popular culture, and gender. Pollitt's books include Reasonable Creatures, Essays on Women and Feminism, Subject to Debate, Sense and Dissent on Women, Politics and Culture, and Antarctic Traveler, a book of poetry. She has written for The Nation since 1980. In her interview, Pollitt reviews the advances feminism has made thus far and debunks anti-feminist writers exploring options for contemporary women and men negotiating both career and family. Question. You're a strong advocate of equal women's rights across the globe, saying that certain human rights are fundamentally morally right, and claiming that they are the root of many social and economic problems. However, many people are reluctant to presumptuously impose their own values on other cultures. What do you see as the right balance between respecting another culture's values and ensuring women's human rights? Katha Pollitt. That is a tough question that can be answered on many levels. In the real, practical world, walking into another culture with all your fine ideas probably won't get you very far. Any more than it would get an Islamic fundamentalist very far if he showed up in this class and tried to persuade you to live according to those precepts. Culture is not a single thing. Think of our own culture. It has aspects that are retrograde, violent, and callous, and aspects that are humanistic, humane, and generous. Which is the real America? They are both the real America. I would think that every culture has in it the potential for both oppression and liberation. There are many different possibilities within each culture, but a Western person, an American person walking into a foreign culture and telling people how they should live is probably not going to be a very successful project. You have to devote yourself for a long time to living in places and understanding how they work and trying to see what people there need. Maybe for them, the veil is not the big issue. Maybe the big issue for them is education, which is what, in fact, almost any Afghan woman would tell you. They would say, forget the veil. That is not the problem. The problem is we do not know how to read. We do not have enough to eat. We do not have any doctors. We cannot live lives that fulfill any of our possibilities. Question. Do you think that a magazine like Glamour or 17 can in fact have positive political empowering messages, or does the overall context wipe them out? Katha Pollitt. I think you said it yourself. Glamour under Ruth Whitney, the previous editor, always had one or two serious articles about something that was really interesting. My experience writing for Glamour was a nightmare because they made me rewrite everything to fit their idea of their reader, who was not as intelligent as I think their readers are. But still, these were articles about serious things. I won prizes for these articles that did not actually appear in the format in which I had written. The magazines for grown-up women are the same. Vogue, Elle, Marie Claire. They have the occasional piece of real content, and the official message is be all that you can be, except it's be all that you can be, have a facelift. Maybe I'm being too puritanical. I like clothes, I wear makeup, I even like to cook, a recipe or two, but the relentless focus on appearance is depressing. The notion of beauty is unbelievably narrow and destructive. You know how it is that the official message is one thing, but the real message is something else? I will give you an example. Let's take eating disorders. I had a graduate student who was very beautiful, slender, and charming. At a certain point, she started talking about the eating disorders that she used to have. This woman had a figure like she had just walked out of the pages of 17 magazine, but in her past, she had had this problem. So what does she do now? She works for the Bulimia Foundation. She goes around to high schools and talks to the girls about the terrors and horrors of eating disorders. But actually, she's a walking advertisement for eating disorders. All a teenage girl would think looking at her is, oh wow, if I make myself throw up enough, maybe I can look like that. They wouldn't have some 200-pound woman go around to school saying, all right, so I am overweight, but the important thing is that I'm not bulimic anymore. Instead, they have a really cute girl so that the official message and the actual message being given are in contradiction to each other. I think women's magazines are like that. Question. Are there any instances in which you think the feminist movement has gone too far for its cause? How can feminists go about spreading their message without alienating many who might share their views but disagree with their methods? For example, those who might want gender equality but associate feminists with bra-banning extremists. Katha Pollitt. Assuming there is still something called the feminist movement, which is also a little problematic, I would say it is too tame. It is always trying to say, yes, having an abortion is such a terrible, terrible thing, but it should be your choice. When was the last time you had someone identified with the pro-choice movement? Someone from the NARA, someone from the feminist majority, someone from the National Organization of Women now say, sometimes having an abortion is a really good idea. Sometimes having an abortion can be a way that a woman really does solve a terrible problem. Sometimes it can be a mark of being an adult. If you look at the 15-year-old who has the baby and the 15-year-old who has the abortion, it is not so clear that the one who has the baby is the one who is doing the mature, responsible thing, as opposed to the one who is thinking a little bit about what kind of mother she can be and what kind of life she and the child are going to have. Pro-choice organizations tend not to talk this way. They emphasize the moral pain and agony of this decision in order to say this is a serious choice. Women are not frivolous. But to me, you have already considered too much when you have said that. Why is it on the table that to decide whether to have a baby could ever be a frivolous choice? It is never a frivolous choice. You know your life as no one else does. Why should you have to demonstrate to the world that you are suffering about it? The feminist movement should become much more radical. And if people are afraid of it, they should give people something to fear. How about that? I like that. That is such a good soundbite. I know I'll win a lot of friends and influence people with that. Minow, legal scholar. Minow's research focus includes equality and inequality, human rights, war crimes and genocide, and pluralism. She's written several books including Making All the Difference, Breaking the Cycles of Hatred, Memory, Law and Repair, and Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, Facing History After Genocide and Mass Violence. Minow explores with us the origins of hateful acts, the path from vengeance to forgiveness, and how to change people's consciousness. Question. In Breaking the Cycles of Hatred, you list forgiveness as an inadequate response to collective violence because no one can be ordered to forgive. Forgiveness must be granted, and to expect forgiveness from victims is to re-victimize them. However, for the societal scars of violence to truly heal, shouldn't forgiveness be an ultimate goal for all responses to violence, even if it is not required of initial collective responses as you suggest? Minow. I have struggled to try to articulate what the alternatives are to vengeance on one side and forgiveness on the other. It is a good question to ask. What's so bad about forgiveness? Isn't that the goal? When I started researching this question and I tapped into the great resources of Harvard libraries, I found that there was very little written about forgiveness. The only material I found when I started writing about forgiveness in 1996 was in the Divinity School library. There were very strong and powerful writings about forgiveness in various theological traditions, but people in the different religious traditions disagreed over whether forgiveness should be granted before there has been contrition by wrongdoers. Different traditions have very different views about that. Some think it is the granting of forgiveness that could be the triggering act for the change of the wrongdoer. Others feel strongly that forgiveness should not be given until there has been a change by the one who committed a wrong. It struck me as a very basic point that we could recapitulate some of the very conflicts that we are trying to avoid if we emphasize forgiveness, because there are different religious views about forgiveness. Second, whatever forgiveness may mean in these different traditions, there seems to be commonality in the recognition that forgiveness involves the victims relinquishing their sense of resentment, however rightfully it was earned. Minow goes on to add, this kind of response, expecting forgiveness from victims, really made me think about how wrong it is to assume or expect forgiveness, especially from people who have been severely victimized. In a profound sense, the only thing that the victim of serious violence possesses immediately after the violence is control over his or her own response to that experience. If that experience is taken away and the person is told, do not respond the way that you are responding, it is wrong for you to hold on to resentment, it seems to me a further deprivation, a further dishonoring of that victim. Question. Earlier you mentioned that there is a big difference between the practical and ideological aspects of war. As Americans, we often rely on thinking of war as an ideological issue because we are not as familiar with the practical aspects and instead see it romanticized in movies. Do you think that there is a way to bring to people a real consciousness and understanding of war on a very practical level? Would that change their minds about being so willing to invade other countries? Minow. There was a thought experiment somebody had not long ago that I thought was pretty good. If in order to launch a war, a public official had to actually press a button that was implanted inside the body of a human being, and the only way to actually press the button was to cut open the human being, that could bring home the fact that human beings will die when that button is pressed. This is just a thought experiment, but it is a good one. At the moment, there is no immediate experience of killing or death for the president or the Congress who authorize war. In contrast, it is striking that the military in America are the least enthusiastic about war. People who have actually had experience with war are not in favor of starting a new one. To think about institutional, practical, and imaginative ways of bringing home the reality of war to the people who make the decisions seems to me an awfully good idea. When The Children of Heracles, a Euripides play, was recently produced by the American Repertory Theatre in Cambridge, there was a brilliant and courageous decision made not only to produce a play that deals with the issue of refugees, but to produce it in a contemporary setting. A further inspired decision was to involve real refugees in the production. Many students from our local high school who are themselves refugees became involved in the production and appeared each night. The producers tried to make this play function the way that theatre did at the time that Euripides wrote, when theatre was about contemporaneous politics. Theatre was about creating an arena where citizens could actually see and debate the issues of the day. Here in the Cambridge production, the play was introduced each night by a panel discussion including a refugee and an observer of the current political or historical context. This helped make the play seem immediate and urgent and generated extensive audience discussion about living through war and loss. It is hard to think about going to war in the abstract after such discussions. The combination of personal stories, dramatic narratives, and structural analysis could motivate people to think and behave with more attention to human consequences. Question: how can we develop international bodies that deal more with issues related to national sovereignty and possibly work towards developing international law or even an international conception of morality? Minow: the most important contributors to the development of the ideas and even the practice of public international law for the last 50 to 70 years have not been governments. They have been non-governmental actors. They have been grassroots organizations and international non-governmental organizations. These NGOs have been important both in articulating the content of these ideals and also in creating processes of monitoring, exchanging, communicating, pressuring, and shaming behavior. As it turns out, the intellectual force and the muscle in the movement for international human rights is not in government and not in the UN. There's something very exciting about that because it suggests that actually there is power in the weak. In fact, the powers of the weak over time may be more powerful than the powers of the strong. Those people who work for governments and the UN have enormous sets of constraints about what they can do, what they are willing to do, and what they are politically able to do. People who do not have all of those obligations may have more freedom, more ability to maneuver. A promising response to globalization in its corporate form is growth in civil society, which takes a comparable international transborder form. Question: should people who hope to make a positive difference in the world follow in your footsteps and get law degrees? Minow: my advice is not to go to law school. Law school makes sense, as was true in my case, if you think that the materials you want to spend time using your mind to grapple with are legal materials. If you have a passion for law, or if you think that you really want to litigate, or that this will give you the kind of credibility you will need in settings that you want to go to, by all means go to law school. But if you are looking for ways to make a difference in the world around these issues, the more immediate and greater need is to affect the consciousness of people. Law is a limited means for doing that. It would be far more effective to write screenplays or to work on elementary school curricula. Ask yourself, what have been the most influential experiences in shaping your ideas about the world, about violence, about human dignity? What are the images that you have? What are the ideas that you have? Events unfolding in history may be the most indelible in people's minds, but also influential images are from mass media, and here I am thinking of film and television as much as the news. I have several students who have earned law school credit for writing screenplays, and even one who sold one. Write plays, write fiction, write journalism, produce rock videos, figure out ways to affect people's consciousness. Swanee Hunt, diplomat, U.S. Ambassador to Austria, Director of the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she also teaches. Hunt talks about her experience in Austria, the roles women play in peacemaking activities, and the challenges they face when they step up to the plate. Question. On the issue of getting involved in making a difference, for those of us who are not independently wealthy and may be facing just graduating from college, are there particular steps that you see as being important? We often question, do I run for office? Do I teach? Do I become involved in a non-profit organization? What do you see as being the most crucial steps to doing something about the way things are? Hunt. I am always tempted to answer this question straight because you are asking it straight. I could make up something. I could say, quote, well, it's really important to have different kinds of experiences and understand how the society works from different perspectives. So I would recommend that you vary your life experiences and do this and do that, especially in your 20s, blah, 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 end quote. But the truth is, you can make all the plans you want in terms of how you are going to get there. And if you're a planner, please go ahead and make your plans. The chances of your life evolving according to your plan are probably less than 5%. Only do it if it is a comfort to you. Follow your passion and learn from the places that you get yourself into that you absolutely hate. You will probably learn more there. You will be miserable, but you will learn about the way the world is dysfunctional while you are getting crushed in the middle of it. Jennifer Leaning, physician. Leaning is a professor of international health at the Harvard School of Public Health and director of the Program on Humanitarian Crises and Human Rights at the school's Francois Xavier Bagnoud Center for Health and Human Rights. A founding board member of Physicians for Human Rights, she is an authority on questions of humanitarian crises, medical ethics in emergency settings, and humanitarian law. Her work has taken her to conflict zones around the world, including Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and the Chad-Sudan border. Shortly before this interview, Jennifer Leaning returned from a Physicians for Human Rights mission to Afghanistan, where her investigations of potential human rights abuses included visits to a prison holding Taliban forces. Question. On terrorism and how other nations view America. Jennifer Leaning. I do believe it is pretty important to try to understand that millions of people elsewhere in the world have a very different view of this country and a very different view of how it is that they can make a better life for themselves. It is important for us to understand that, and this is where I think the two links come together. If we are ever again to recreate the innocence and certainty in the future that we had just a few years ago, we are going to have to extend a sense of human security to other people elsewhere. This is the blowback about globalization. We are never going to be able to be isolated and okay. We are only going to be okay if others are more okay than they are now. Question. Often a good solution for solving health-related problems and epidemics in times of crisis is to educate the people themselves. For example, teach them how to protect themselves from disease or filter water for drinking. What is being done to teach people how to help themselves in these situations? Jennifer Leaning. A key component in public health, which actually could be borrowed and expanded into virtually any social enterprise, is to educate the general public. Public health is about the health of populations, the health of large groups. It is not about the health of individuals. When you're thinking about the approach to populations, the fact is you cannot order everybody around all the time. So you will want to get some cooperation and some compliance. In addition, given the chance, human beings are going to want to protect themselves and care for the people they love, and given a slightly better chance, if they are not angry and filled with vengeance, they're going to have a more general social sense of probity and kindness. If you approach populations that way and you want to get them to do something, the fundamental strategy is education. In public health and disasters, it is turning out to be absolutely critical for those in charge of the responses and rebuilding to tell people what is going on honestly. Say when you do not know something and do your best to find out the answer, if it is a reasonable question. Tell people what it is that they can do to take charge of their lives and protect their families and friends and their community groupings. Say when you're going to come back with a new message and a new engagement so people can pack their questions as they accumulate and have faith that you're going to come back and talk with them again. Have the people who are doing this communication be a combination of leaders the people have previously trusted. Do not try to do this with a new leader. And have this public form of education linked to an expert, because not all the problems that come up in public health mode in a crisis are problems that a regular leader is going to be an expert in. Question. As a physician, what perspective or particular concerns do you bring to the conversation about how best to utilize and distribute our resources? Jennifer Laney. The fundamental point remains that there are an unacceptable number of people dying young and an unacceptable number of people dying in childbirth. Similarly, we can see the gap in the indices around health and water and food and education and hope. The expectation that one can have a reasonable life and be secure in that life and have children and feel okay about oneself. That is not a set of expectations that large parts of the world can remotely hope to aspire to. Just realizing that differential is, first of all, the most important aspect of starting the next phase, which is, what are you going to do about it? I would submit that whether you want to be a rock musician, a physician, or a nuclear physicist, part of what someone coming out of college must be challenged to say to himself or herself is, how is this going to make the world better for all these people who have very little? I am not speaking about another Albert Schweitzer initiative. The world is more complicated. Figuring out whether you're fitting in and keeping an edge of discomfort all the time in your mind and in your heart and in your reading and in all your interactions is, to me, an essential part of being in this world now. We have no excuse not to recognize that we are unutterably privileged, and whatever flick of fate meant that you were born here and not in many parts of the world that I am speaking about does not give you any reason to think that they matter less than you do. Do things that make what I just said seem real to you. Travel, dream, read, go to movies that are increasingly good about bringing these people home to you. And do not forget that all the sacrifice that your family has put behind you and all the work that you have done to be here, I respect it deeply as I know how hard it is to be here and succeed here, is not going to amount to anything at the end of your time when your life is shut out if you cannot also say, I did this for others as well. Harvey Cox, theologian. Author of 10 books including The Secular City, Cox has been teaching at Harvard Divinity School since 1965 and is the author of 10 books including most recently When Jesus Came to Harvard, Making Moral Choices Today. He has written extensively on urbanization, world Christianity, Jewish-Christian relations, and contemporary spiritual movements. In this interview, Cox discusses the market economy in terms of its religious function, the ethics of market values, and how much is enough. Question. Katha Pollitt, whom you quote, says there will be a double movement whereby society will prevent the disembedding of the economy. Is Pollitt's thesis correct, or can the market triumph over social relations, making us all commodities? Harvey Cox. Briefly, Katha Pollit's argument is that there have always been and always will be markets in every society, whether it is a little street vendor or a fair or a bazaar. However, in previous history, markets have been guided and checked by a range of other institutions, families, states, religious institutions, and customs. The markets have not been allowed to have the dominant role in forming the meanings or values of the society. What has happened in the last 150 years, he argues, is that the market has become the dominant institution of Western society, and now increasingly all around the world. The market controls not just economic life, let me underline that. The market affects not just economic life, it affects what we believe is important in life, what we are striving for, what we believe is wrong with us and the society, and what we are to do. In other words, the market is generating the values and meanings by which hundreds of millions of people are living. I am arguing that this is the function which in many societies in the past has been that of religion or that of God. The market is now God in that sense of the word. I think you're asking whether the battle is over. Is this a God who is never going to have any real contenders? I don't think so. I sense a growing restlessness on the part of many people with what the market values. The market values production, efficiency, competition, but the market does not have any value that it assigns to gentleness, to compassion, or to some of the things that we know from our own experiences are not only important, but vital to human life. I sense, especially among young people, a suspicion of the market. So much suspicion, for example, about television commercials that there is now a second wave of commercials trying to sell you things by using irony and self-caricature to build this suspicion into the commercial and disarm your criticism of it. Still, I do not think, in the long run, human nature being what it is, that this kind of cheapening and evisceration of human values can last forever. I certainly hope not. We are in a stage now in which the market is utterly dominant. There is hardly anything challenging it, and it is even assigned a kind of messianic role. If only the market could spread throughout all the world, then hunger would be gone, there would be democracy everywhere, there would be all these good things, and the market is the key to it all. But notice that in Christianity, Judaism, and some other religions, the Messiah has not come yet, or at least has not come back yet in Christianity, and has not come yet in Judaism, and you are advised to wait patiently for the benevolent outcome. Well, a lot of people have been waiting for quite a while in many parts of the world, and the situation is getting worse and not any better. So their confidence in this particular messianic figure of the worldwide market is being undermined. We are beginning to see and will see a larger backlash against it. I certainly hope so. Question. Could you elaborate on how you think the contest between the market and religion will play itself out? Also, what are the possible outcomes even after the conceivable backlash against the market system? Harvey Cox. I would not characterize it exactly as a contest between the market and religion, so let me reconfigure that a little bit. I am not suggesting that the market is God only as a metaphor. I am arguing that it functions in many parts of the world as a faith. Phenomenologically, it does what religions have most frequently done. It provides the stories, metaphors, symbols, rituals, myths, values, and meanings that religions have provided. It is functioning as a religion. So this is really a contest among religions. This is a battle of the gods. Furthermore, I do not think that I would let religions get off so easy. Religions have also surrendered to some extent to the market god. Just turn your television on late at night and see the marketing of religion that goes on, selling God's favors, selling the favors of a particular spiritual tradition. I am afraid that churches, synagogues, and other religious movements can very easily be co-opted into a market vision of the world. So-called mega churches are springing up all over the United States. Huge churches of 5,000 or 6,000 people, many of them based on market surveys. You go into the community and talk to people, largely those who are not going to church, and you ask them what they like and do not like about church. You organize focus groups, then you devise a sort of religious product that is going to meet the widest market niche, and you roll it out, and that is a mega church. We could also think about universities, which have begun to conceive of students as customers. There was a time in the university tradition, not so long ago, in which we were all colleagues, here as a learning community, learning together, listening to each other, and helping each other. More and more, the image that the university administrations are creating is this. We have a product that is education. We have a catalog, a sales force of recruiters, great colored brochures, and we also have customers who have come and pay for the product. But what this does is to diminish, even evacuate the human content of the relationship of teacher to student, of student to student, of an intellectual community. It makes it something cheaper. I strongly dislike that invasion into the university of the marketing mentality. Back to your question. I do not want you to think that I am suggesting a battle between bad market and nice religion. I think we need a market. The market is an essential institution in any culture or society. What I am criticizing here is the escalation of the market to the predominant meaning and value-creating institution of the whole society, the market as God. and I do not want religion to get off as easy as the phrases of your question implied. Question. You wrote that you did not think that this new religion of the market would inspire the international traditional religions to lead a new jihad or crusade. How have your opinions changed in light of September 11th and the response to it? Harvey Cox. At the moment I wrote that, I was hoping, frankly, for a tiny little crusade, for a modest jihad against the market religion by the traditional religions. I will come clean on that. I was hoping for a somewhat more confrontational attitude toward market values and the market god on the part of existing religious institutions, where I find confrontation or critique sadly lacking. By and large, religious institutions are just going along with this juggernaut and not raising questions about how it debases human life and human values. Now, once in a while, a little mini crusade breaks out. For example, not too many years ago, a market developed around the world in human organs. If you happened to be a rich person from the Western world and you needed an organ, say a kidney transplant, it could be arranged. You could fly to India or Turkey or some other places and purchase a kidney for a modest price of several $1,000s. The kidney would be taken from a poor person, usually a woman, who would be given a modest sum of money and told that she would be fine with just one kidney. And the market began to grow. At that point, some people began to say, wait a minute, is there anything in the world, anything at all, that should be excluded from the category of commodity? I remember a couple of years ago teaching a course with Professor Alan Dershowitz and the late Stephen Jay Gould, in which we talked about this very subject, the sale and purchase of human organs. To my considerable surprise, when we asked the students how many of them thought it was perfectly okay, almost half of them said yes. They argued that if people are poor and they want to make some money and they want to sell their kidney, let them sell it. They have a perfect right to do so. For me, this position completely overlooked the enormous asymmetry in power between the people buying the kidney and those selling them. This was one instance in which the various religious communities of the world, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, said, here we have to say no. The human body created in the image of God is not to be put on sale. That is not something we buy and sell. There are limits. Now, I think we have to start drawing some other limits pretty soon. Who owns the sky? There was a movement a few years ago to put advertisements on satellites in the sky so that we could see them blinking, I suppose for many, many years. That may mean transforming the sky into a commodity. No one then could look up into the sky on a starry night without seeing an advertisement for such and such a product. Think about it. I would like us to begin to compile a list of things that we would like to see excluded, if not by law, then at least by moral consensus, from the things that are for sale in the world. Start with that. Religious communities of the world can help with that question. What is valuable? What has value in life beyond what you have in a purchase and sale agreement? Question. In addition to stating that people are treating the market as God, you also mentioned that the market, like other religions, is not subject to empirical proof. How would you respond to the criticism that people do not view the market as a religion, but as a scientifically proved theory? Could it be that, like evolution is a scientifically proven theory, people are just changing their minds about how the world really does work? Harvey Cox. That is a perfectly legitimate question. There are, however, many people in the world who have deep reservations about whether the market theory of how one organizes economies is in fact proven as the best theory for everybody. The people who have those doubts tend to be those who have not benefited from the global spread of the market economy, but in fact have experienced in the last 20 or 30 years a widening gap between the concentration of wealth on the part of those who have and less on the part of those who don't have. It is interesting to me how those who profit from the market economy tend to believe it is something that is self-evident. Those who do not profit from it are the ones who have questions about it. There is an interesting epistemological question. How does that happen? How do you have that discussion? Consider Brazil. Brazil is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, the largest country in Latin America, and a country that has been described by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as their laboratory for how successful a market system would be. But now, nearly everyone agrees that in Brazil, this strategy has been a miserable and complete failure. Brazil has the widest disparity between rich and poor of any country in Latin America and the third largest of anywhere in the world. So now Brazil is trying a different strategy. For some people, that suggests that the proof is not quite in yet that the market economy is the solution to the whole business. At least millions and millions of Brazilians feel that is still an open question. They want to try something else rather than the market road to prosperity, success, and fulfillment. Let me underline that I do not want to be understood as saying that there should be no markets in the world. I am talking about the overemphasis, the over-expectation, the overselling of the idea of the market economy as the elixir that will cure everything, as the God we can count on. The other reason I struck on the idea of God is that I remember being told when I was a kid that you may not see what God is doing now. It may look bad or wrong, but if you wait long enough, farther along, you will understand. You trust the providential hand, as it were, even though the evidence may go the other way. It requires an act of faith. It says in Hebrews 11, quote, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen yet," end quote. We're often asked to have that kind of confidence in the market. I think especially of the people who sell stocks. Well, the stock market is down this week, but it will go up again. Believe me, it will go up again. Why should I believe you that it's going to go up again? Maybe it's going to keep going down. Well, in the past, it has gone up and down. Inevitability is not a very good argument. Here's what I'm saying. The question you raised about the contending ways of dealing with hunger, famine, unemployment, illness, and homelessness among enormous numbers of people around the world is certainly not solved yet. Regarding salvation through the religion of the market God, I am a skeptic. If you're going to ask me if I am a believer, this is one God I just do not believe in. I am pretty close to being an atheist about the God of the market, but let's say for the moment that I am a pretty strong agnostic. I think the burden of proof has to be on the other side that it is really the solution. Question: to what extent do we see the beginnings of a global civil religion? Some set of symbols and rituals that would unite people across the globe, regardless of religious differences or nation-state differences. One might think of Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, or the Dalai Lama as the secular saints of such a possibly emerging global civil religion. Could such a global civil religion be a counterweight to the religion of the market? Harvey Cox: I think at least Gandhi and the Dalai Lama would be a little surprised to hear you characterize them as secular saints. Certainly not. What is important to me about these two enormously significant figures in our history is that they are indeed rooted in a particular religious tradition. Gandhi lived and died a Hindu, but always said that it was Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that was the most important source of his life and his philosophy. As a Buddhist, of course, the Dalai Lama incarnates or embodies another whole view about what the good life is about. Being a Christian, I think we are at a moment in religious history in which we have an enormous amount to learn from traditions other than our own. In this case, the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And we have the opportunity, I think especially of Buddhism, which is the tradition of the Dalai Lama. Some years ago, I spent some time in Japan studying Asian religious movements and especially Buddhism, which is the great temple city south of Tokyo, and I noticed there in front of one of the temples a statue of the founder of one of the Buddhist movements. It struck me that he looked rather like St. Francis. He was wearing a ragged robe with a rope around his waist. He wore sandals and he carried a walking stick. So I asked my companion, who spoke Japanese, to read the inscription on the base of the statue, which said, quote, "If there is one thing that I have learned in life, it is how much is enough," end quote. I thought that was what the whole trip to Japan. If you can learn during your lifetime how much is enough, you have really learned something very important, something that the market God is never going to teach you. The gospel of the market God is that you never have enough, you need more. The whole logic of the religion of the market is based on accumulation, growth, and expansion. But there is wisdom in some of the other traditions, that of St. Francis or Buddhist teachers or Hindu saints, that we desperately need as a kind of counteraction to the ethic of the market God. Paul Farmer, physician. a globe-trotting doctor who divides his time between Haiti and Harvard. He's one of the founders of Partners in Health, which works with local communities delivering comprehensive healthcare in less developed countries. He's a professor of medical anthropology at Harvard. In this conversation, Farmer, a noted writer, speaker, and activist, discusses the inequalities of the world and the obligation to combat the dual epidemics of poverty and disease. Question. In your fight against the almost overwhelming crisis of HIV and AIDS and the global inequities in healthcare, do you ever reach a point when you decide you have done a good job or done enough, even if you haven't reached your utopian destination? If you never do reach that point when you feel you have made enough progress, how do you keep momentum and energy and idealism alive? Paul Farmer. You said almost overwhelming. I would just go ahead and say overwhelming. Who said I am not overwhelmed? I find it completely overwhelming. People constantly ask us, how are you keeping the work going in Haiti? Especially now, just a few days after the overthrow of democratically elected President John Bertrand Aristide. Our work has not stopped, and it will not stop, because we work with Haitians living in their home villages, as well as with Haitian health professionals. The work cannot stop. In other words, I am working with a community of people and not solo by any stretch of the imagination. When one of us feels overwhelmed, there are others on the team who might not feel overwhelmed. My colleagues and I remind each other, if they, the people we are serving, and who are living with these awful conditions, and I am not only talking about diseases, but also about having to worry about feeding your kids or getting clean water, if they do not despair, then how can we arrogate despair for ourselves? How can we say that we are going to allow ourselves to be despairing or hopeless? This just may be an effective strategy for keeping sane. Be connected to others who are not overwhelmed at the same time that you are, and realize that the people you serve are not allowing themselves to be overwhelmed and despairing. Those are two important parts of the answer to your question. A third antidote to despair for me would be the things I like about being a clinician, whether as a doctor, nurse, social worker, or another person providing direct services. In our work, even when you're losing the battle on the grand scale, you can still have small victories with individual patients or their families. In my line of work, which is infectious diseases, most people do get better. For a person in rural Haiti living in horrible poverty and with AIDS, if you treat her correctly by getting her on the medications she needs and providing her with the necessary social support, she will actually get better, even though the conditions around her might not improve anytime soon. We all want big victories that we can point to as adding up to something, as changing the world. Everybody wants that. But even when you cannot convince yourself that your work is meaningful on that scale, there are still small victories. Now, that might sound a little bit craven, as though I'm saying, quote, well, if the definition of success is too daunting, just ratchet down the definition of success, end quote. I am not saying that. I am saying it is important to be mindful of the need for large victories and to not feel overwhelmed. But it is also important to be mindful of the fact that the small victories are important too. Sometimes they're all you're going to get. Question. In your interview with Caleb Hellerman, you stated that the average cost of HIV treatment in the US would be in the range of $10,000 per patient annually, compared to $1,500 annually for those who are treated by your organization in Haiti. How have you been able to work with drug companies? Have you succeeded in obtaining price cuts despite the fact that it hurts their high profitability and bottom line? Paul Farmer. I have some updates for you from the time that interview was conducted, and most of the news is good. First, however, I should point out that the $10,000 I cited, the lowball US estimate, is probably the cost of the medications alone. I do not think that the estimate includes lab work, physician and nurse costs, and certainly not hospitalization. As for the second figure, it now costs around $150 per patient per year for a good 3-drug combination, reduced dramatically from $1,440, which was a concession price from the research-based pharmaceutical industry. To answer the first part of your question, how have we done it? We did it through coalition building. We did it by working with the World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders, and a group called the International Dispensary Association. There are also other players now on the scene. The second part of the question is the really hard part. The research-based pharmaceutical companies can reasonably argue, I suppose, that they have to be profitable or their stockholders will not be satisfied. I am not an investor, but I can understand their point of view. However, I would say in honesty that the profitability of the drug companies is not my concern. My concern is for the welfare of my patients. I am not saying that to irritate. I think there's a mutual respect between doctors and people involved in the research-based pharmaceutical industry. So it does not seem unreasonable for someone who is a physician to not concern him or himself with the profitability of pharmaceuticals, but rather with the welfare of the patients at hand. That said, let me review my response. 1. We have continued to drop the price of antiretroviral therapy to around $150 per patient per year. 2. Coalition building is how we did it. 3. The profitability issue is not my primary concern. The question of funding is a real dilemma and I do not know the answer. We have to find a way to finance drug development for the diseases of the poor. There must be a way, perhaps through a mix of public and private resources. After all, the everyday cash flows of the international financial markets are unthinkably huge. There are also enormous cash flows in the public sector and in the international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Those are not private cash flows. Those organizations are publicly funded by member states and ultimately by citizens. Furthermore, I think most of you already know that the research-based pharmaceutical industry is the most profitable of all international commerce, year in and year out. It has the highest return on investment, and it spends more on advertising than it does on research and development. Where do I get this information? From left-wing conspiracy magazines like Fortune. You get this information right from their own literature. Those facts are important to have in the debate, but we also have to acknowledge that the research-based pharmaceutical companies are under great pressure to produce high returns for their investors. We are not going to alter the structure of the modern corporation in time to develop new meds for diseases that afflict the poor. We have to create novel funding strategies. Question. It seems that you have chosen to balance your life more in favor of the good works you do than your family or other things that might bring you more personal happiness. Do you ever regret the little time that your chosen path leaves for friends and family? Paul Farmer. Most of my friends and family are involved in the same work I do. If I told you what my daughter said to me yesterday about the current situation in Haiti, you would never believe it. She said that she wanted to go to a demonstration. Now, if she says something like this to people who are not deeply involved in this line of work, they're going to think we are brainwashing the kid. She's only 6. But she did say it. I did not tell her to say it. It is true. You cannot make this stuff up. It is really a different issue for me. The natural affiliation of my own friends and family and associates is really around the work we all do. Everybody needs escape to life's simple pleasures, laughter and forgetting and so on. But sometimes, laughter and forgetting come at a pretty high price psychically because the world is so riven by the problems that you are considering in this class. The striking thing about the world to me is its inequalities. 50 years after the development of effective treatment, tuberculosis was still the leading infectious killer of adults in the world until it was surpassed by HIV disease. That is crazy. People die of diseases for which there are vaccines that cost 12 cents. The question of making meaning in difficult times, everybody grapples with that. I am certainly not satisfied or self-satisfied. I keep asking myself, am I doing enough? Are we doing enough? But rarely do I ask, is this meaningful at all? For me, what I do is the most compelling thing I could be doing. Question. You have said that as members of the community, we must recognize that we can and should summon our collective resources to save the countless lives that were previously alleged to be beyond our help. How can the average citizen go about summoning the resources to further your cause? Paul Farmer. For me, as a teacher of medical students, as a doctor, and as an anthropologist, I think that it is probably not a good idea for me to be prescriptive and say you should do it this way rather than that way. In my experience, one of the things that people need to do is figure out what appeals to them personally. If you're going to devote time to good works when you already have plenty of other things to do, then you have to like what you're doing. It has to be appealing to you because of another condition of modernity, the impression that there is not enough time. I feel that terribly, the time pinch. When I get involved in things that I consider to be compelling issues, it has to be something that I do not dislike doing, and I hope that that is not too Acadian. For example, I could not be a full-time policy maker working in a think tank. I just would not be good at it. I have to be around patients, but other people love that sort of thing and are good at it, and we need those people. Maybe the last thing that you expected me to say is, it depends on your personality. The hard part is figuring out what you like to do and how you can remain engaged over time. Amy Goodman, journalist, the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, the largest U.S. public media collaboration and the only national radio and TV news show completely free of corporate underwriting. Goodman presents a range of voices often unheard in mainstream media. In this interview, Goodman recounts her personal stories from the field, from interviewing President Clinton to marching alongside Timorese as they protested years of Indonesian occupation and genocide. Question. When describing your interview with former President Bill Clinton, Michael Powell of the Washington Post said that you are the reporter who sinks her teeth in and never lets go, and that your questions prompted Clinton to scold, quote, "You have asked questions in a hostile, combative, and even disrespectful tone," end quote. Is it necessary or worthwhile to ask the difficult questions in a tone like Clinton describes? Are the difficult questions more or less effective when they are asked this way? Amy Goodman. First of all, I think it is important to point out that that is how Clinton characterized it, because those in power interpret any kind of questioning in that way. We describe in detail what happened that day in the exception to the rulers. Quote, "Then I asked him about the sanctions against Iraq at the time and about the UN Secretary and Assistant Secretary Generals too, who had quit, saying they were genocidal. He said they were liars. I asked him about Ralph Nader. I asked him about racial profiling. Al Gore said if he were president as the first act in office, he would outlaw it. But I said, you were both in power for 8 years. Why did you not do it then? It was the promise versus the record," end quote. At some point, Clinton made a comment about my tone. I had given him a chance, in full, to answer every question, but I think the reason he said that was because presidents rarely get asked tough questions. In this country, journalists treat them as royalty on bended knee. Presidents are simply the employees of the American people. When this opportunity arose, I felt it was my responsibility to ask the questions so many people had asked for so long. The next day, the White House called and basically said I would be banned from going to the White House. I said, "What are you talking about?" He called me. I did not call him. They said that I did not follow the protocol, and I said, "What protocol?" "The questions we'd agreed to." "Who'd agreed to?" They said, "We said that he would talk about getting out the vote. Maybe questions 1, 4, and 7 of your questions were related, but the others..." I said I had made no agreement. I submitted no questions to you. They said, "We said he had 2 or 3 minutes." I said, "For God's sake, he's the most powerful man in the world. He can hang up if he wants to." We talk about this incident in the exception to the rulers, what it means, and why it is that these kinds of questions are not asked. I did not consider it hostile questioning. I simply considered it doing my job. Question. You have dedicated your life to a career in pursuit of journalistic integrity. In retrospect, do you think it is necessary to forsake the idea of family, given your own experiences as a successful reporter, journalist, and activist? Do you have any regrets or feel as though you have missed out on something because you have dedicated your life to social activism? Amy Goodman. I don't know who actually said this, but it was a quote that always sticks with me. Quote, "I think back on my life and all the times I thought I went too far. I realize now I did not go far enough," end quote. There's just so much that has to be done. It is not about sacrifice though. I get great joy out of my work. Family can be defined in so many different ways. I have a wonderful family that I was born into, and the people I cover in many cases have become extended family. It is incredible the entree that you have into people's lives with just a microphone and the trust that they place in you. I will briefly tell the story of East Timor, which is a story that we write about in The Exception to the Rulers. The idea is what all media should be and has fallen far short of. The media has reached an all-time low in this country. But it is not just about the media. I think the most important role to play in life is as the exception to the rulers. How many of you know the story of East Timor? I bet you know it for one of two reasons, possibly Noam Chomsky, who wrote about it forever, or because of independent media. You are not going to get it from other places in this country. Corporate media hardly covered this for well over a decade. It is one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Indonesia invaded East Timor in 1975. Just as East Timor, a small Catholic country that had been colonized by Portugal for many years, was gaining their independence from Portugal. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. Gerald Ford was the president. They went to Indonesia and met with Suharto, the long-reigning Indonesian dictator, the day before the invasion and gave the go-ahead for the invasion. On December 7, 1975, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor by land, by sea, by air, killing thousands of Timorese, then tens of thousands. They closed the country to the outside world, and for the next 17 years, they killed off a third of the population, proportionately worse than what happened in Cambodia. In 1990, I got a chance to go to Timor with my colleague Elaine Scarry. We found a true hell on earth. In 1991, we went back because for the first time, a delegation commissioned by the UN was going to investigate the human rights situation. We wanted to see what happened. Alan and I followed a procession one day, November 12, 1991, of 1,000 people that walked from the main Catholic church in Dili, Timor, 300 miles north of Australia. On this day, the people were marching from the church to the cemetery. Many of the people were college age. There were thousands marching. Old women in the traditional Timorese garb, girls in their Catholic school uniforms, boys in their school shorts. They marched and they unfurled banners that they had written on bed sheets that said things like, "Why did the Indonesian military shoot our church?" They appealed to President Bush Sr. They appealed to the UN. They appealed to anyone to do anything about this killing field. In a land of no freedom of assembly, no freedom of press, no freedom of speech, the Timorese march to the cemetery was the biggest act of civil disobedience the Indonesian military had ever seen. When they got to the cemetery at about 8 o'clock in the morning, everyone was crowded around. They were exhilarated, though very afraid. Thousands more had joined from home, work, and school. Then we saw, from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s at the ready position. People at the back were hemmed in by the walls of the cemetery. The soldiers marched up, 12 to 15 abreast. Alan and I were asking people, "Why are you here?" They would say, "For my mother, for my sister, for my brother, for my village that was wiped out." Then we saw these soldiers marching up. I put my headphones on. I always hid everything so that the soldiers would not see us interviewing Timorese. It would only endanger them. But now we knew the only hope might be if the soldiers saw Western journalists. They had committed many massacres in the past, but never in front of Western journalists. I put my headphones on and held up my microphone like a flag. Alan put up the camera above his head. At the time, he was writing for the New Yorker magazine. I was doing a documentary for Pacifica Radio. We walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up, still 12 to 15 abreast. They rounded the corner. Without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation, they swept past us and opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down, a little boy behind us, exploded from the gunfire. And they kept on shooting. The soldiers beat me to the ground. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire, and then he threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury. They took their US M16s and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. We were lying in the road, covered in blood. Timorese were being killed all around us. A group of soldiers came up and put their guns to our heads in firing squad fashion. They were screaming politique, politique, because to bear witness is political. They were also screaming Australia, were we from Australia? We knew what had happened to the Australian journalists in 1975 at the time of the invasion. They had lined 5 of them up against the house and executed them. There was one left. The day after the invasion, they dragged the last man, Roger East, who was reporting for the world out of the radio station in Delhi, the capital. As he shouted that he was from Australia, they shot him into the harbour. The Australian government hardly raised a peep about these killings, maybe because a few years later they would sign the Timor Gap Treaty with Indonesia, dividing up the oil spoils that belonged to Timor between Indonesia and Australia. Oil has been the source of so much pain in the world. As we lay on the ground, we said, "No, we're not from Australia, America, America." We were stripped of everything at that point, still lying in the road. The only thing I had left was my passport, and I threw it at them. At some point, they decided to take the guns from our heads. We believed because we were from the same country their weapons were from, they would have to pay a price for killing us that they never had to pay for the Timorese. They moved on. A Red Cross jeep pulled up and we got into it. Dozens of Timorese jumped on top of it and on top of us. We drove like that as a human mass to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us. We were not in worse shape than the Timorese. Hundreds of Timorese were killed on that day, more than 270, and that number matters. But I think they cried because of the things we represent to the people not only of East Timor, but all over the world. One is the sword and the other the shield. We are the sword because all too often the US government provides military weapons to repressive regimes or uses them against other populations themselves. But Americans also represent the shield. It is the idea that every little act we engage in makes such a difference in the world because we come from the most powerful country on earth. Just a call to a Congress member or a walk to Harvard Square in protest for workers' rights is hard around the world, especially when you come from the most powerful institution in the most powerful country in the world. It makes an enormous difference. They know that. On that day, that shield was bloody. It just increased their despair. By 1999, the people of East Timor finally got a chance to vote. Incredible. What they had asked for all those years, and in 2002 they won their freedom. Alan Nain and I returned on May 19th, 2002 to join with the people of East Timor to cover them as they celebrated their independence. Out on the sandy plain of Tasitolo, outside of Dili, the people gathered 100,000 strong. As the clock struck midnight, Sanana Gusmalo, the rebel leader of East Timor, now the founding president, ascended the stage and raised the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. The people looked up at the fireworks display, and you could see the light of the display in their tear-stained faces. This nation of survivors had won. They had resisted and they had won, though they had paid an unbelievably high price. They won because of their own persistence and resistance, but also because of the solidarity of people all over the world. They knew they could not do it without them. It left an indelible image, and it follows me everywhere I go. Every day I do the broadcast. Whatever age you are, whatever you're doing, whether you are a student or a professor, employed or unemployed, a janitor, a painter, working in the school bookstore or the cafeteria, every hour of every day we have a decision to make. And that is whether to be the sword or the shield. Oh my god, that was harder. That was harder than I expected. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. I was not expecting that. Whew. I was not expecting that.